Section 18 of Edmond Dantes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Manolakis. Edmond Dantes by Edmund Flagg. "The ministry provokes its fate," he said in a low tone as he approached. "Whom the gods would destroy, they first make mad. These men suffered 70 reform banquets all over France. The 71st one they prohibit, and that, too, by the exhumation of an old despotic edict of 1790. This is exactly what we would have. It was the first, not the last, banquet they should have suppressed. Barrot was right today in the chamber when he said that had this manifestation been suffered, the people would have become tranquil." "Tranquil, indeed!" cried Ledru-Rollin. "That's exactly what we have apprehended. No, it is too late. This reform banquet was, at first, but an insignificant thing. In it we now recognize the commencement of a revolution. The various announcements and postponements of this banquet have caused an agitation among the masses favorable to our wishes, and the threats and obstinacy of the ministry have completed the work. The hopes, fears, doubts, and disappointments attending this affair have put the mind of all Paris in a ferment, and excited passions of which we may take immediate advantage." "Aye," cried Louis Blanc, "now may we do what I have always wished and counselled. We, the Communists, may now take advantage of a movement, in the origin or inception of which we had no hand." "True, most true," observed Marrast. "This is the work of the dynastics, Thiers, Barrot, and the rest, the commencement of a reform under the law which we design to make a revolution paramount to all law." "They begin to fear already that they have gone too far, those discreet men," said Louis Blanc, smiling bitterly. "Did you observe how they shuffled to-night at M. Barrot's, and finally resolved to abandon the banquet, but, as a sop to the people, pledged themselves to impeach the ministry?" "Ah, ha, ha!" laughed Ledru-Rollin. "Just as if their abandonment of the banquet is to keep the people away from it tomorrow, any more than the ministerial ordinances. Why, not one man in 10,000 knows of the existence of these manifestoes. But the faubourgs have been promised a holiday for a fortnight past, and they don't intend to be put off again." "Whether the dynastics designed or wished to be compromised in this affair," remarked Marrast, "they certainly are committed now, and it is too late for them to get out of the movement. Indeed, I view it as nothing less than a union of all the oppositions against the Crown, aye, against the Crown, and for a republic. We comprehend this, they don't. They have not, like us, waited 17 years for a signal for revolution. And now, before God, I believe the hour is at hand. This is no accidental insurrection of the 5th and 6th of June, '32, no outbreak at a funeral, no riot of operatives, no unmeaning revolt as in '39. It is a reform, with the first names in France as its advocates and supporters, which we will make a revolution if we can secure the National Guard." "The National Guard is secured already," said Louis Blanc. "Are they not of the people? At least 20,000 of the National Guard are Republicans. Of the remaining 40,000, nearly all are well disposed or neutral in feeling. Have I studied the National Guard for 20 years in vain, and have all the measures of the Communists to secure them, when the crisis came on, proved utterly ineffectual? On the National Guard we may rely. The Municipal Guard are picked men, and well paid to support the throne. They will fight even better than the Line. With the Line and the National Guard the people must seek to fraternize from the beginning. With the other troops they have solely to fight. But after all, general facts and principles only can be laid down. Circumstances utterly beyond human control must direct and govern, and vary and determine results when the period of action arrives, and arrive it may at any hour of the day or night. At this moment Paris sleeps on a volcano, the fires of which have long been gathering through many a fair and sunny day. God only knows when the volcano will burst, but when the hour comes, let the people be prepared." As these enthusiastic words were uttered, the dark eye of the speaker flashed and his lip quivered. The silver clock on the mantel, beside which the conspirators stood, struck the first quarter after 2. The night was waning, but the festivities seemed rather to increase than diminish within the salons of the magnificent mansion, while the storm howled even more drearily without, and the rain, at intervals, in heavy blasts, beat even more fiercely against the northern casements. As Louis Blanc ceased speaking, M. Flocon entered the salon, and, as if by some preconcerted arrangement, at once sought his political friends. "What of the night, watchman?" cried Ledru Rollin, as the editor of La Réforme approached. "The latest news, for that's of an hour's age doth hiss the speaker, as the English Shakespeare says. The news, good or bad?" "As I entered," said Flocon, "the house trembled with the jar of a train of heavy ordnance, attended by tumbrils and artillery caissons, and escorted by a regiment of horse, which rolled along the pavement of the Champs-Élysées." "Good!" answered Marrast, with enthusiasm. "All night," continued Flocon eagerly, "through darkness and storm, whole regiments of infantry have thronged the line of boulevards which stretch from the Tuileries to Vincennes, and each soldier bears upon his knapsack, in addition to all his arms, an axe to demolish barricades. The garrisons of the arrondissements of Paris are already 70,000 strong, and the troops of the line are concentrating around the Palais Bourbon and the Chamber of Deputies." "Excellent! Most excellent!" joyfully exclaimed Louis Blanc. "The affront will not be wanting. But where is M. Dantes?" "He is still with the chiefs of the faubourgs and the committees of the Freemasons and workmen, in the Rue Le Pelletier, issuing his last instructions for the morrow. Messieurs, that man is a magician. His zeal in the good cause puts the boldest of us all to the blush. By the most indefatigable energy and indomitable perseverance, he has brought about a systematic, almost scientific organization and fraternity, through various modes of rapid intercommunication between the innumerable classes of operatives of every description throughout the whole capital and its faubourgs, so that, within 6 hours, he can have in military array an armed mass of 100,000 blouses upon the boulevards. The workshops alone, he tells me, can furnish 50,000. The rapidity with which he conveys intelligence through this immense army, and their utter subservience to his will and subordination to his orders, are all so wonderful that it is impossible to determine which is most so. To control a Parisian populace has hitherto been deemed a chimera. With M. Dantes, it is an existing reality. Not an army in Europe is so obedient or so prompt as his army of workmen. The secret is this: they know him to be their friend. All over Paris are to be seen his workshops, savings banks, hospitals, and houses of industry and reform, and in the suburbs his phalansteries and his model farms. That he has the command of boundless wealth is certain, but whose it is, or whence it comes, no one can divine, and never did man make use of boundless wealth to attain his ends more wisely than he does. Why, I am told that the pens of half the littérateurs and feuilletonists of Paris have for years past been guided by his will and compensated from his purse to accomplish his purposes. The mysteries of Paris and the Wandering Jew are but two of the triumphs of his policy, and his system of philanthropy seems not bounded by France, but to embrace all Europe. The Swiss Protestant and the Italian patriot have each felt his effective sympathy as well as the French workman, and in the same manner as with the operatives, so has he obtained influence and weight with the National Guard, and to such an extent that of the 60,000, one half would obey his orders with greater alacrity than those of Jacqueminot himself. I tell you, messieurs, he is a magician." "Hush, hush!" cried Marrast. "He is entering now." "He pauses and looks around him," said Louis Blanc. "He looks for us. I will go to him," remarked Flocon. "He looks for his wife," replied Louis Blanc. "There, he catches her eye. See how eagerly she flies to him." "That is the finest pair in Paris," remarked the journalist. "And the most devoted," added Ledru Rollin. "They have been man and wife for some time, it is said, and any one would take them for lovers at this moment." "Have they children?" asked Flocon. No, but Monsieur Dantes has by a former wife a son and daughter, who rival in good looks the celebrated children of our friend Victor Hugo, returned Louis Blanc. I met Arago, Lamartine, Suy, Chateaubriand, and some other celebrities at his mansion in the Rue des Helder one night recently, continued Barast, and I thought I never saw a house arranged with such perfect taste. The salons, library, picture gallery, cabinet of natural history, conservatory, and laboratory were superb. Everything, in short, was exquisite. And then one is always sure to meet at Madame Dantes' soirees, added Louis Blanc, exactly the persons who, of all others, he wishes to see, and whom he would meet nowhere else, poets, painters, authors, orators, statesmen, and artists of every description. In fine, every man or woman, whether native or foreigner, distinguished for anything, is certain to be met with at Monsieur Dantes' house. I once met there, said Flocon, Rachel, the actress, and Van Hamburg, the Lion King. Monsieur Dantes is a perfect Mecenas in encouraging merit, as everyone knows, remarked Marrast, and he manifests especial solicitude to show that he appreciates worth more highly than wealth, genius than station. Poverty and ability are sure recommendations to him. Madame Dantes is, I am told, as devoted to the good cause as her husband, remarked Flocon. She is a second Madame Roland, exclaimed Louis Blanc. France will owe much to such women as she and her friend Madame Tudevant. She differs greatly from Madame George Sand in some respects, I fancy, said Marrast. But if she at all rivals that wonderful woman in devotedness to the cause of human rights, whether of her own sex or ours, she deserves well of France. In her charities, it is notorious, she has no rival. Half the mendicants of the capital bless her name, and she is at the head of a dozen associations and enterprises for the amelioration of the condition of the destitute, suffering, and abandoned of her sex. Upon my word, messieurs, cried Ledru Rollin, your praises of Monsieur Dantes and Madame, his beautiful wife, are perfectly enthusiastic. So much so that in your zeal you utterly forgot another matter quite as momentous. I am so unfortunate as to know Monsieur Dantes only as one of the great pillars of our noble cause, and a man who, for nearly 6 years, has proven himself an apostle of man's rights, and ready, if need be, to become a martyr. That's enough for me to know of him. But who really are Monsieur Dantes and his wife? Asked Flocon. Who really are any of us? Laughingly rejoined Louis Blanc. Who really is anyone in Paris? Continued Marrast. The blood royal always and alone excepted. Of Monsieur Dantes, this only is known, said Louis Blanc, that for 5 or 6 years past he has been a deputy from Marseille, Lyons, and other southern cities, all of which have been eager to honor themselves by returning him as their representative, as one of the boldest and most eloquent republicans in all France. As for Madame Dantes, we know her to have once been Countess de Morcerf, but now the wife of our friend, and one of the noblest and most lovely matrons in Paris. What need have we to know more? But our friend comes. While this conversation was proceeding, Dantes and Mercedes had joined each other, and their hands were quietly clasped. Is all well, Edmond? Was the anxious inquiry of the fond wife, in low, soft, musical tones, as she fixed upon his pale face her dark eyes, beaming with a tender solicitude. All is well, love, replied the husband. You will pardon my protracted absence when I tell you it has been unavoidable, will you not, Mercedes? Will I not? What a question! But I have been so anxious for your safety, knowing the perilous business in which you are engaged, and the night is so tempestuous. You forget that I have a constitution of iron, dear, replied Dantes. You forget that I was a sailor once, and the storms were my playthings. But you will go home with me now, Edmond, will you not? She anxiously asked, placing her little white hand on his arm and gazing beseechingly into his eyes. Have I ever passed one night from your arms, my Mercedes, since we were wed? Was the whispered response. Ah, love, any pillow but thy soft bosom would be to me a thorny one. You have spoiled me forever, he added, smiling. "And shall we go now, Edmund?" eagerly asked the delighted woman. "Oh, I'm so weary of this fate." "I must exchange a few words with our friend Louis Blanc, whom I see yonder, with others of our party, and then, dear, we will to our pillow. We are both weary. Au revoir." "Edmund, Edmund!" cried the lady as her husband was going. "Do you see Joliette and Louise in the redowa yonder?" Dantes looked, and with a well-pleased smile nodded assent. A more brilliant and well-matched pair could hardly have been found. Joliette in the splendid uniform of an officer of the Spahis, and she in her own magnificent beauty, fitly garbed. Monsieur Dantes was received with marked respect by the knot of Republicans as he approached. "I am delighted to meet you all, and to meet you tonight, or rather this morning," said Dantes, warmly, "in order that I may render you an account of my stewardship for the past 6 hours. They have been hours big with fate, and the first day of Republican France has already commenced. Messieurs, we can no longer remain blind to the fact that the long-looked-for, hoped-for, expected hour has come, the hour to strike home for liberty and for France. Tomorrow the streets of Paris will swarm with blouses. The Marseillaise will be heard. Barricades rise. The ministry be impeached. Next day the National Guards will fraternize with the people. Blood will flow. The ministry resign. On the 3rd, the king abdicates. The Tuileries are surrendered. A regency is refused. A republic is declared. And this day, 2 weeks hence, liberty will be shouted in the streets of Vienna and Berlin, and every throne in Europe will tremble. The honors of prophecy are easily won," continued the speaker with a significant smile that lighted up his features, pale with enthusiasm and exhaustion, "when the problem of 17 years approaches solution with mathematical certainty." "Are our plans all complete?" asked Louis Blanc. "So far as human forethought or power could render them so, our efforts have, I trust, been effectual," was the reply. "Yet the events of every hour will induce changes, and render indispensable policy now undreamed of. Ah! Messieurs, we must none of us sleep now, not a moment must escape our vigilance, not an advantage must be sacrificed. We can afford to lose nothing. Without leaders, the people are blind. Not for an instant must they be abandoned. Tomorrow, let the masses gather at different points. Next day, let barricades choke the boulevards, and if the conflict come not, be it precipitated, provoked. Thursday, 100,000 men must invest the Tuileries, and a provisional government be declared in the Chamber of Deputies. The Bourbons will then be in full flight, and France will be free. And now, messieurs, will you permit me to suggest the propriety of our separation? Yonder ministerial secretary has had his eye upon us ever since he entered." The expediency of the suggestion of Monsieur Dantes was at once perceived. The conspirators parted, and one after the other, by different routes, shortly disappeared. As for Monsieur Dantes, he threw himself carelessly in the way of the ministerial secretary to whom he had alluded, who was no other than our friend Lucien Debray, and saluted him with most marked and winning courtesy. "Will the ministerial secretary suffer me to compliment him upon his indefatigable industry and exertions tonight to fortify order in Paris and sustain the administration?" Debray bowed somewhat confusedly at this remark, and having returned a diplomatic reply, from which neither himself nor anyone else could have elicited an idea, Monsieur Dantes continued the conversation. "Let me see, it is now nearly 3 o'clock," he said, consulting his repeater. "At 2:30 you received an order, signed by the Duke of Montpensier, and directed to the War Ministry, commanding that 72 additional pieces of artillery be transported from Vincennes to Paris before dawn. That order was issued, and the ordnance is now on the boulevard." "How?" exclaimed the astonished secretary. "At Vincennes the horses of the flying artillery stand harnessed in their stalls. All night infantry have been pouring into Paris, and, obedient to midnight orders, every railway will disgorge at dawn additional troops." "Are you a magician?" asked the astonished secretary. "Shall I reveal to you the ministerial tactics for the morrow's apprehended insurrection?" coolly asked Dantes, with a smile. "The salons of the Tuileries have not been deserted to-night. "Can you quell an insurrection, General?" asked the king of the Marshal Duke of Islay. "I can kill 30,000 men," was the humane answer. "And I, sire, can preserve order in Paris without killing a score," said Marshal Gerard, the hero of Antwerp, "if I can rely on my men." "What is your plan, Marshal?" asked the king. "Shall I give you the Marshal's reply, my friend?" "You were present! You know all!" exclaimed Debray. "Not quite all," thought Dantes, "but I shall before we part. Well," continued he, aloud, "the Marshal's strategy was this, exceedingly simple and exceedingly efficacious, too, provided, to use the Marshal's own words, he can rely on his men. It is this: occupy the Tuileries, the Hôtel de Ville, the Halles, the Louvre, and other prominent points with a heavy reserve of infantry and artillery, and sweep the boulevards and the rues Saint-Honoré, de Rivoli, Saint-Martin, Saint-Denis, Montmartre, and Richelieu with cavalry. A simple plan, is it not? Almost as simple as that of the insurrectionists themselves. A barricade on every street, and 100,000 men in the Place du Carrousel." "The government will not yield, monsieur," said Debray firmly. "The minister is unshaken. To crush an unarmed mob cannot severely tax the most skilful generals in Europe." "True, they are unarmed," returned Dantes, with apparent seriousness. "Their leaders should have thought of that. Arms are so easily provided. But then they can rely on their men." "We have yet to see that," replied Debray, with some asperity. "True, we have yet to see it. It is only a matter of belief now, then it will be a matter of knowledge. Seeing is knowing," added M. Dantes, with his peculiar smile. "But pray, assure me, M. Debray, are the ministry and their advisers indeed sanguine of the issue to-morrow?" "They are certain," replied the Secretary with energy. Then, feeling he had, perhaps, made a dangerous revelation, he quickly added, "I have the honor, monsieur, to wish you a very good night. It is late." "Say rather, it is early, monsieur," replied Dantes. "I have the honor to wish you a very good morning." The Secretary returned the courtesy, turned away, and, after exchanging a few words with M. Thiers, disappeared. "They are certain, then," soliloquized M. Dantes, as Debray quitted the salon. "I was sure I should know all before he left." Then, rejoining Mercédès, who was patiently awaiting him, they stepped into their carriage, as the drowsy tones of the watchman rose in the misty air. "Past 4 o'clock, and all is well." End of 18.
Section 19 of Edmond Dantes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings on the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Edmond Dantes by Edmund Flagg. Chapter 17. The Revolution Begins. Tuesday, the 22nd of February, the birthday of the immortal Washington and the first of the 3 days of the French Revolution of 1848, broke darkly and gloomily on Paris. The night had been tempestuous, and the wind still drove the sleet through the leafless trees of the Champs-Élysées and howled drearily along the cheerless boulevards. The streets were dismal, desolate, and deserted. Here and there, however, through the gray light of the winter dawn, could be caught the semblance of a figure closely muffled, whether for concealment, disguise, or protection from the biting blast was doubtful. Stealing along, these figures often met and exchanged ominous signs of recognition. "Is the procession still to take place?" asked one of another of these persons, pausing for an instant as they hurried along. "Yes," was the emphatic answer. "Dupont, Lamartine, and 16 others who are faithful or resolute." "And the rendezvous?" "Is the Place de la Concorde." "And the hour?" 12. Whereupon the conspirators parted. Gradually the number of persons in the streets increased as the morning advanced. Chiefly these were artisans, lads, blousons, and workmen. "Whither so early this disagreeable morning?" cried a peaceable-looking shopman of the Rue de Rivoli, who was taking down his shutters for the day, to a friend who was hurrying by. "I don't exactly know where I'm going," was the reply. "We were all roused at daybreak, in the Quartier Saint-Honoré, by the rappel, and so I happen to be awake." "And are the National Guard turning out in good numbers?" "No, they don't turn out at all. The drummers are followed by a crowd of gamins in blouses, who shout 'Vive la Réforme!' and sing the Marseillaise." "The National Guard don't turn out!" cried the alarmed shopman. "Then I'll not take down my shutters." And as his friend moved on to the Madeleine, he took the precautionary measure he had spoken of. At 9 o'clock troops were in motion all over Paris, and the roll of the drum was heard in every street. At 10 o'clock 10,000 men were assembled at the Madeleine. "Is there to be a banquet?" asked one of another as they met on the Rue Royale. "No, it is a procession. The people are to march to the Chamber of Deputies and sing the Marseillaise." All the avenues to the Palais Bourbon and the part of the place around the Madeleine were now occupied by the 21st Regiment of the Line and mounted municipal guards. Before the Chamber of Deputies was marshalled, a squad of dragoons and a battalion of the 69th Regiment of Cuirassiers stood ready to charge on the throng. At 11 o'clock 2,000 students in blouses from the Parthenon were joined by an immense column of workmen from the Faubourg, and having fraternized in the Place de la Concorde, advanced in perfect order in procession, led by National Guards, shouting the Marseillaise and the hymn of the Girondin. Slowly and solemnly moved the vast mass up the Rue Royale to the Pont de la Concorde, leading to the place of the Chamber of Deputies. At 12 o'clock the vast arena between the Chamber of Deputies and the Madeleine contained 30,000 people. Along the railing of the church was drawn up a regiment of horse. A man in a tricolored sash 3 times read the summons and ordered the crowd disperse. The order is disregarded. The charge is sounded. The dragoons rush with sheathed sabres on the mass. Again and again they charge, but they cut down none. All at once a heavy cart with a powerful horse is discovered. The people seize it. The horse is lashed into fury. He rushes on the double line of dragoons and the chasseurs. A breach is made. The crowd dash through. Some rush up the steps of the Chamber of Deputies. They force the gates. They even enter the hall. Then, suddenly, panic-stricken at their own audacity, they rush back. At this moment, along the Quai d'Orsay, gallops up a strong detachment of the mounted municipal guard, led by General Peyronet Traverse Sebastiani, brother of the Marshal and uncle of the unhappy Duchess of Praslin. A charge was ordered. The crowd was driven over the bridge, and the municipal guard, a company of dragoons, and the squadron of hussars took up position at the foot of the obelisk of Luxor. "Long live the dragoons!" shouted the people. "Down with the municipal guard!" accompanied by hootings, groans, shouts, and showers of stones. The troops with sheathed sabres charged. One of the immense fountains afforded the gamins a place of shelter. Suddenly the flood of water was let on, and they fled. Thus began the Revolution. 1 o'clock tolled from the tower of the Madeleine. The area was clear. Cavalry patrolled the boulevards. Infantry, bearing besides their usual arms implements for demolishing barricades, axes, adzes, and hatchets. Each soldier, one upon his knapsack, followed. At 2 o'clock, at the Hôtel des Affaires Étrangères, at the corner of the Rue Capucine and the boulevard, an immense mass of men ebbed and flowed like tides of the sea, and a tempest of shouts, groans, and choruses to national songs arose. A commissary of police in colored clothes, and with a tricolored sash, led a body of municipal guard into the court. Deliberately they charged their muskets with ball. "In the name of the law!" shouted the commissary. "Vive la ligne!" responded the people, as they slowly retired. "Away!" cried a trooper to a blouse, in the Place de la Concorde, at the corner, near the Turkish embassy. "Away, or I'll cut you down." "Will you, coward?" replied the artisan, calmly, with folded arms. At that moment a body of the people rushed on the municipal guards, and drove them for safety into their barracks. Then they fled themselves to avoid the fusillade of the enraged troops. On the Pont de la Concorde the people stopped the carriage of a ministerial deputy, and saluted him with groans. The next moment Armand Marrast, of Le National, approached and was most rapturously cheered. The money changers, those seers of Napoleon, scented not yet the revolution. On Friday the 3 per cents were 75 francs, 85 centimes. On Tuesday, they opened at 73 francs 90 centimes and closed at 74 francs. The day advanced. The Republican and Communist power augments in a systemized order. Paris swarms with insurgents. Bakers' and gunsmiths' shops are plundered. Barricades are thrown up. A column rushes down the Champs-Élysées, and having been repulsed in an escalade of the railings of the Chamber of Deputies, retires, shouting the Marseillaise and a chorus from the new opera of the Girondins, Mourir pour la patrie. At dusk, a deputation of students at the office of Le National presents a petition for the impeachment of the ministry. That impeachment had already taken place. "What news?" shouted a student to a workman as he hurried along. "There has been fighting in the Faubourg St. Marceau. Half a dozen municipal guards have been carried wounded to the hospital of Val-de-Grace, and a captain was killed. And is it true that the guard has been disarmed on the Rue Geoffroy, in Langevin, and a gunmaker's shop near the Porte Saint-Martin broken into and rifled?" "I hadn't heard of that," was the hurried reply. "But I hear this, that the guard-houses in the Champs-Élysées have been taken, and the troops driven off, and that lamps and windows have been torn down." At that moment another workman rushed along. "The news!" shouted the student and the first workman. "The railing of the Church of the Assumption has been torn away by the people to supply arms. 2 women of the people have been crushed by a charge of the municipal guard. The shop of Lapage, the armorer, and the Rue Richelieu has been entered by means of the pole of an omnibus and used as a battering ram, and barricades rise on the Rue Saint-Honoré." At 3 o'clock a column of people dashed down the boulevards, smashing lamps and breaking shop windows. In the Rue Saint-Honoré and the Rue de Rivoli, an omnibus and 2 carriages were seized to aid in erecting a barricade. A guard-house in the Champs-Élysées was burned. The troops at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs were increased. No one was suffered to pass. A municipal guard was dismounted and nearly killed by the people. The crowd in the Rue Royale had become so dense that it was impossible to pass to the Place de la Concorde. The troops charged. The people gave way. Some were wounded badly, but still rose to the shouts, "Vive la Ligne! Down with the municipal guard!" In the Place Vendôme stood a regiment of the line. There was the hotel of Monsieur Hebert, the Minister of Justice, and Monsieur Hebert was hated by the people. "Down with Hebert, the inventor of moral complicity!" yelled the populace, but they made no attack. It was 10 o'clock at night. Many of the shops were closed, but the cafés and restaurants were thronged. From time to time the shouts, "Down with Guizot!" and "Vive la Réforme!" were heard, and also the roll of drums as a body of troops passed along. Knots of individuals gathered around the doors of bakers' shops, and while they eagerly ate their bread and sausage, as eagerly denounced Guizot and the ministry. But all was comparative order in Paris. End of section 19. Section 20 of Edmond Dantes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Edmond Dantes by Edmund Flagg. Chapter 18. The Midnight Conclave. It was 12 o'clock at night on the 22nd of February, 1848. Lights still gleamed in the vast edifice of the National printing office, and in the editorial chamber were assembled the chiefs of the Revolution. "All goes well," said Louis Blanc. "The blow is struck. Let it only be followed up, and the efforts of the past 10 years will not prove vain." "How true was the opinion of M. Dantes respecting the National Guard," said Marrast. "How true also respecting the workmen," said Albert. "How true respecting the ministry," said Ledru Rollin. "But where is M. Dantes? Why is he not here?" At that moment the private door opened, and M. Dantes, Flocon, and Lamartine entered. "The news from the Chambers," cried Marrast as they approached. "3 impeachments of the ministry have been proposed," said Lamartine. "By whom? By whom?" asked Louis Blanc. "By whom presented?" "One by Odilon Barrot, one by Duvenier de Haran, and one by M. Guinaud, deputy from Toulouse." "And what said Guizot?" asked Marrast. "Nothing. He only laughed when the papers were handed him by old President Souzy." "Ah," cried Ledru Rollin, Few deputies were there, continued Flocon. The opposition benches were vacant. Guizot was there early, pale and troubled, but stern and unbending. All the ministers followed him. What was discussed? Asked Marrast. The Bordeaux Bank bill. Ah, cried Ledru-Rollin again. Yes, continued Flocon. Until 5 o'clock that bill was discussed. Barrot then ascended the tribune and deposited a general proposition to impeach the ministry. And what was done with it? Asked Louis Blanc. The president raised a sitting without reading it, but announced that the bureau should have it for the examination on Thursday. Infamous! Cried Ledru-Rollin. It is all as it should be, said M. Dantes calmly. And the peers, what of them? The Marquis de Boissy made an effort to get a hearing on the state of Paris, but, of course, it was in vain. Is it true, asked Flocon, that the Rappel has been beaten today? It was beaten in the Quartier Saint-Honoré at dawn, said Louis Blanc, and this evening, at about 5 o'clock, in several of the arrondissements. But no reliance need be placed on the National Guard. They are with us. They are of the people. They shout Vive la Réforme. But the municipal guard in the line? I am told that an immense body of them was this evening, at about 8 o'clock, reviewed by the king in the Dukes of Nemours and Montpensier in the Place du Carrousel, said Flocon. That's true, said Ledru-Rollin. I witnessed it myself in passing, and I could not help saying it is the last. 6,000 troops of the line are on the boulevards, from the Madeleine to the Porte Saint-Martin, said M. Dantes. The Hôtel de Ville, the Place de la Bastille, de la Concorde, and du Carrousel, and the quay frown with artillery. Tomorrow will be a warm day. It has been rather warm today in some parts of Paris, said Louis Blanc, smiling. Was there ever a grander spectacle than that in the Place de la Concorde at noon? At least 100,000 men were assembled. Rushing across the bridge, they gathered around the Chamber of Deputies. Then from the southern gate of the Tuileries issued 2 bodies of troops, one of mounted municipal guards, and the other infantry of the line, and, pressing on the dense mass, they drove them over the bridge. Only a few old fruit women were crushed beneath the horses' hoofs, and a few of the troops were wounded by pebbles, however. At the same time, said Flocon, all the chains in the Champs-Élysées were in requisition for a barricade, as well as all the public carriages, and the people sang the Marseillaise, the Parisienne, and the hymn of the Girondin. A guard-house was also consumed. Have you heard Bijos remark at noon, when looking upon Place de la Concorde? Asked Marrast. We have been too busy today to hear anything, said Ledru-Rollin. Ah, we shall have a day of it, said the bloodthirsty old hero. I care not for the day, said the pale Guizot, but the night. The people made quite a demonstration about Guizot, I hear, said Flocon. They assailed him with a shower of groans, it is said, and some of the gamin flung pebbles at his gates. The most significant shout before the Office of Foreign Affairs was this, said Ledru-Rollin. Countess of Leven, where is the minister? And the very moment this was occurring, said Flocon, I understand that Monsieur Thiers, on his return from the chamber, is passing through the Champs-Élysées, nearly escaped a most unwelcome ovation from the people. The 2 rivals were duly and simultaneously honored, it seems. Thus much for today, said Marrast. What of tonight? Barricades rise all over Paris, said M. Dantes, but we can do no more. Let us each retire to his home. Tomorrow the National Guard will fraternize with the people, and the ministry will resign. A few words of parting salutation passed, and all departed. M. Dantes and Lamartine left the office in company. What say you, Edmond? Asked Lamartine. Will your wife spare you long enough from her pillow to make with me a brief tour of the town? Mercédès is rather exacting, said Dantes, with a laugh. But if your fair lady will suffer your absence, mine must do the same, I fear. Well, then, let us first to the Hôtel de Ville, that grand centre of Paris and all that is revolutionary. As the 2 friends passed along, conversing on the events of the day, the anticipations of the morrow, they were met, from time to time, by knots of men, at the corners, eagerly recounting the incidents of the hour. The roll of drums was heard in the distance, heavy and measured tread of infantry, the clatter of cavalry, and the lumbering of artillery, as they passed on their way. All the shops and cafés were closed. Many of the lamps were demolished, and others were not lighted, the gas being shut off. A fearful gloom brooded over the city. The winter wind swept sharply and cuttingly along the deserted streets, and rain, which froze as it fell, at intervals dashed down. The Hôtel de Ville was encompassed by troops as the friends approached it. "Is that a cannon?" asked Lamartine, pointing to a dark object that protruded from an embrasures of the edifice. "It is," replied Dantes. "Then the revolution has indeed begun. Artillery in the streets of Paris." "Behind each column of the portico of the Chamber of Deputies this day frowned a concealed cannon," was the significant response. The friends turned off from the Hôtel de Ville, and crossing the right branch of the Seine, were under the deep shadows of Notre Dame. But all was tranquil and still. Only the howlings of the wintry blast were heard through the towers and architectural ornaments of the old pile. Up the Rue Saint Jacques, in the Quartier Latin, they then proceeded, but the students and the grisettes seemed to be fast asleep. Turning back, they passed the fish market, and here a large body of cavalry had bivouacked. Patrols marched to and fro. Officers in huge dark cloaks smoked, laughed, and chatted, regardless of the morrow. The friends went on. All was dark in the faubourg which succeeded. Not a light gleamed, save in some lofty casement, and the fainting candle of the worn-out needlewoman, or the overtasked student. "Ah!" exclaimed Lamartine, as they passed one of these flickering lights, "who knows what plotting head and ready hand may be beside that candle? Who knows of the weapon burnished, the cartridge filled, and the sabre sharpened by that light for tomorrow?" "The morrow!" exclaimed Monsieur Dantes. "That morrow decides the fate of France." And the friends parted. End of section 20.
Section 21 of Edmond Dantes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Edmond Dantes by Edmund Flagg. Chapter 19. The Second Day. The 23rd of February dawned on Paris as a city under arms. Artillery frowned in all the public places. The barricades of the preceding night had been thrown down as fast as erected. National Guards thronged the thoroughfares. The people swarmed along the boulevards. In the neighborhood of the Porte Saint-Denis and the Porte Saint-Martin, barricades rose as if by magic, but were, as if by magic, swept away. Cavalry bivouacked in the streets, and ordnance was leveled along their entire extent. The avenues were closely invested, and even old men and women were arrested on their way to their own thresholds. From time to time single shots or volleys of musketry were heard in the distance, and wounded men were carried past to the hospitals. The government had ordered all public carriages to be cleared from the stands, that material for new barricades might not exist when the old ones were demolished. But the people were busy, too, for the iron railings at the hotel of the Minister of Marine in the Place de la Concorde and at the churches of the Assumption and Saint-Roch had been torn away to supply weapons of attack or defense, or implements with which to tear up the huge square paving stones of Paris for barricades. At 11 o'clock, the National Guard of the Second Arrondissement gathered at the Opera House in the Rue Le Pelletier and near the office of Le National. Vive la Réforme! Vive la Garde Nationale! Long live the real defenders of the country! These were the shouts, intermingled with the choruses of national songs that now rose from the people and the National Guard. At 12 o'clock, the Second Legion of the National Guard was at the Tuileries to make a demonstration for reform. Its colonel, M. Bagnières, declared to the Duke of Nemours that he could not answer for his men. At 1 o'clock, accompanied by an immense multitude with whom they fraternized, they were again on the Rue Le Pelletier. A squadron of cuirassiers and one of chasseurs advanced to dislodge them. "Who are these men?" cried the chef d'escadron. "The people of Paris," replied the officer of the National Guard. "And who are you?" "An officer of the Second Legion of the National Guard." "The people must disperse." "They will not." "I will compel them." The National Guard will defend them. Vive la Réforme! Shouted the people. The National Guard and the cuirassiers united. The officer, chagrined, turned back to his men and vociferated in tones of thunder, "Wheel! Forward!" And the whole body resumed its march down the boulevard. An hour afterwards, a still larger body of troops, municipal guards mounted and on foot, cuirassiers and infantry of the line, came down the boulevard and made a half movement on the Rue Le Pelletier, but seeing the hostile attitude of the National Guard, continued their march amid shouts of "Vive la Réforme! Vive la Garde Nationale! Vive la Ligne!" Twice within an hour afterwards the same thing occurred. It was plain that the National Guard fraternized with the people. The 3rd Legion deputed their colonel, M. Besson, to demand of the king reform and a change of ministry. The colonel presented the memorial to General Jacques Minot, who promised to place it in the royal hands. The 4th Legion marched to the Chamber of Deputies and presented a petition for reform. Colonel Le Mercier of the 10th arrested a man for shouting "Vive la Réforme." The man was liberated by his own troops with shouts of "Vive la Réforme." The colonel withdrew. The Cavalry Legion, the 13th, in like manner repudiated Colonel Montalivet. The Municipal Guard was ordered to disarm the 3rd Legion. Both advanced. Bayonets were crossed. Blood was about to flow. At that moment, Colonel Textoris of the National Guard rushed up and exclaimed, "Brothers, will you slay brothers?" The effect was electrical. The muskets were instantly shouldered, and the combatants separated. All over Paris the same scenes took place, with a few exceptions. "Vive la République!" cried Ledru Rollin to Albert, who was hurrying down the Rue Le Pelletier at about noon. "Vive la République!" was the hearty response. "What of the National Guard?" "The Guard fraternizes with the people," replied Ledru Rollin. "What of the blouses and the barricades?" "Last night the barricades of yesterday were swept from the streets, and even the material of which to build them also, the pavements only excepted. Yet at dawn this morning the whole space between the Quartier Saint-Martin-des-Champs, the Mont de Piété, and the Temple, and all the smaller streets were choked with barricades." "And they were at once assailed?" "By the troops of the line, the Municipal Guard, and the Chasseurs of Vincennes." "Who were repulsed?" "With most obstinate bravery. At the Rue Rambuteau the 69th Regiment was 3 times driven back. Also at the corner of the Rue Saint-Denis and the Rue de Tracy. And the Rue Philippeaux, a ball passed through the face of a soldier of the 21st of the Line Infantry, and then through the head of a voltigeur behind him. 16 soldiers fell in the attack on the barricade of the Rue Rambuteau. A blouse pointed a pistol at an officer of the Municipal Guard. The pistol hung fire, and the officer passed his sword through his assailant's body. From this you can infer that we have had close fighting." "I have heard that an assault was made on the armory of our friends, the Leparge brothers, for weapons. Is it so?" "There was an assault at about 10 o'clock, but the windows were too strong to be carried. There has been fighting in the Rue de Petit Carrel and the neighborhood of the Place Royale, I learn. Achmet Pasha, son of Mehemet Ali, is fighting for us with the most wonderful intrepidity. A chef de bataillon of the 34th was slain by a shot from a window, and some offices of the Octroi have been burned. 3 men were killed at the Batignolles, and their bodies were accompanied by an immense throng to the Morgue." "Have you heard that the 5th Regiment, as in 1830, has joined the people, and that on their way to the Préfecture of Police to liberate some of the people who had been arrested, they stopped at the office of La Réforme and were eloquently addressed by our friend Louis Blanc?" "What did he say to them?" "He told them the fight was not yet over, that there must still be a banquet, and that this time there must be no mistake. The workmen must have the freedom they won." Vive Louis Blanc! cried Albert, and in a higher state of excitement than he had ever before been known to exhibit, he hurried off. I am for the Tuileries, said Ledru Rollin as they parted. And I for the Palais Royal, said Albert. We meet tonight at the office of Le National, without fail, at midnight. It was on the square at the south end of the Palais Royal that most blood was spilled between the people and the troops. The Château d'Eau was furiously assailed and obstinately defended, assailed by the people and defended by 6,000 picked troops. The people triumphed. Of the troops, at least 1,000 perished, and the remnant fled. At 3 o'clock, M. Rambuteau, prefect of the Seine, waited on the king and informed him that the National Guard demanded reform and the Municipal Guard a change of ministry. The king, in dismay, convened the ministry. Can the ministry maintain itself? Asked Louis Philippe. That question brings its own answer to your majesty, replied Guizot. If you doubt the stability of your ministry, who can trust them? I have thought of the Count Mole, observed the king. He is an able man, sire, replied Guizot, and his political connections with M. Barrot and M. Thiers may aid him to form a ministry. But, sire, not an instant is to be lost. Your faithful ministers will do all they can, but a ministerial crisis cannot be delayed. And if your majesty will permit the suggestion, the emergency demands that to Marshal Bugeaud be given the command of Paris. You will proceed to the Chamber to announce that M. Mole is entrusted with the formation of a new cabinet, said the king, and the council closed. At 4, an officer of the staff passed along the boulevards, announcing the fall of the ministry. Instantly, with the speed of the telegraph, the intelligence flew to the obscurest parts of Paris. Its effect was, at first, most cheering. Barricades were deserted and arms thrown down. Faces brightened, hands, almost stained with each other's blood, were clasped. Troops and people, unwillingly fighting, embraced. All was triumph, joy, and congratulations. All now is over, all is right at last, was the exclamation of one man of the people to another. Guizot has fallen, but the king has sent for Count Mole, replied a third with a dissatisfied air. No matter, cried the first speaker, the system is overturned. What care we who is minister? It is too late, replied the other. Guizot has been forced away by the people. Mole may be forced away too. So may the king. No more tricks. The people now know their power. There shall be no mistake this time. And the insurrectionists parted. As the day closed, barricades rose in the Quartier du Temple, and there was fighting between the people and the Municipal Guard, but the National Guard came to the rescue, and the latter surrendered. At 9 o'clock, Paris was illuminated, white, red, blue, yellow, orange, green. These were the tricolors of the lamps that poured their rich effulgence from every window on the gloomy scene without. The streets were thronged and the cafés crowded. Men of all nations and Parisians of all classes were in the streets. The rattle of musketry had ceased. The troops were in their barracks and the people at their homes. At the corner of the boulevard in the Rue de Capucine, Flocon and Louis Blanc met. Guizot has fallen, cried the first, and the most intimate friend of the king has succeeded him. What have we to hope for from the change? What are we to do? asked Flocon. In 1 hour the people will sing the Marseillaise before the Hôtel des Affaires Étrangères. The 14th regiment of the line is there, replied Flocon. So much the better. Blood will flow. The revolution will not stop. And the conspirators separated. At 10 o'clock, before the official residence of M. Guizot, himself then absent and probably in full flight for the coast, an immense crowd of the people with torches was assembled. Their purpose was to sing the Marseillaise. The 14th regiment barred the way. The street was dimly lighted. The single row of lamps along the courtyard wall was all the illumination. A double line of troops was the defense. Let me pass, cried the officer of the National Guard who led the people to the officer. Impossible. In the name of the people I demand to pass. In the name of the law you shall not. The people command. Forward, cried the National Guard. Present fire, shouted the officer. There was a roll of musketry, a shrill shriek rang along the boulevard. The vast mass recoiled, the smoke floated off, 63 of the people of Paris lay weltering in their gore. The blow is struck at last, cried M. Dantes, rushing across the boulevard, pale and excited. To arms, people of Paris, to arms! To arms! To arms! Vengeance for our brothers! Was now the terrible cry that burst from the infuriated populace. The congratulation, the illumination, all was lost in the wild wish for vengeance. At 11 o'clock that night an immense multitude, composed chiefly of workmen from the faubourgs, was coming down the Boulevard des Capucines. It was the largest and most regular throng yet seen. In front marched a platoon of men bearing torches and waving tricolor flags. Immediately behind walked an officer in the full uniform of the National Guard, with a drawn sword in his hand, whose slightest command was implicitly observed. Next came a tumbrel bearing the naked corpses of the slain, whose faces, mutilated by their wounds and disfigured by blood, glared horribly up with open eyes in the red torchlight that flared in the night blast around. Behind this awful display marched a dense mass of National Guards, succeeded by a countless mass of the people, armed with guns, swords, clubs, and bars of iron, chanting forth in full chorus not the inspiring Marseillaise or the Parisienne, but in awful concert, sending upon the night air the deep and dreadful notes of the death hymn of the Girondins, Mourir pour la patrie, intermingled with yells for vengeance. Down the boulevards approached the multitude. More distinct becomes the dirge, more redly glare the torches, and amid all more deeply rumble the wheels of the death cart on the pavement. The funeral column reaches the corner of the boulevard and the Rue Le Pelletier. The death hymn rises to a yell of fury. The officer of the National Guard turns the head of the column to the right. Before it is an edifice conspicuous by its illumination of huge and blood-red lamps. It is the office of Le National. The crowd halts. One long, loud shriek of vengeance goes up. It is succeeded by the thrilling notes of the Marseillaise from 10,000 lips, and Marrast, Marrast is the shout that follows. The windows of the front office were thrown up, and the editor, surrounded by friends, appeared. His speech was brief but fervid. He exhorted the people to be firm, to secure their rights beyond recall, and promised them ample retribution for past wrongs and security for future rights. Monsieur Garnier-Page, who stood at the side of Marrast, next addressed the people in the same strain amid thunders of applause. Making a detour to the office of La Réforme, the multitude were addressed by M. Flocon, its editor. Then, proceeding to the Place de la Bastille, the corpses were deposited at the foot of the column of July, and the crowd dispersed. The night that succeeded was an awful one. The streets, which an hour before blazed with the illumination, were dark. Barricades rose in every direction. At every corner, shopmen, workmen, women, clerks, and children were at work. The crash of falling trees, the clank of the lever and the pickaxe, the rattle of paving stones, these were the significant sounds that broke the stillness. Every tree on the whole line of the boulevard was felled, and every lamp-post overthrown. A barricade of immense strength rose at the end of the Rue Richelieu. The troops offered no resistance. They piled their arms, lighted their fires, and bivouacked close beside the barricades. At the Hôtel de Ville, the troops of the line and the Chasseurs d'Afrique quietly ate their suppers, smoked their pipes, and laid themselves down to sleep. On the Boulevard des Italiens appeared 3 regiments of the line, a battalion of National Guards, a regiment of cuirassiers, and 3 field pieces with their caissons of ammunition. The horses were unharnessed by the people, the caissons opened, the ammunition distributed, and the guns dragged off. The troops, guards, and cuirassiers fraternized. End of section 21. Section 22 of Edmond Dantes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Edmond Dantes by Edmund Flagg. Chapter 20, Another Midnight Conclave. Again it was midnight. Again the chiefs of the Revolution of '48 assembled in conclave. The second of the 3 days had passed, but the streets of Paris were all alive with excitement. Every leader of the Reform was there: Ledru Rollin and Flocon, excited and fiery; Louis Blanc, exhausted and agitated; Albert, stern and collected; Lamartine, pale and troubled; Marat, sanguine and confident, all of them more or less disturbed but M. Dantes. As for him, the same calm smile was on his lips, the same mild light in his eye, and the same unchanging resolution upon his countenance. "Who attended the Chamber of Deputies today?" asked Marrast. "Did you, Lamartine?" "I did," was the reply, "and witnessed a somewhat stormy sitting. At 3 o'clock, as usual, old Sauzet took the chair. Our friends were there in large numbers. The ministerial benches were also filled. Immediately after M. Guizot entered, he had been saluted with groans by the 10th Legion, stationed on guard without, and with cries of 'Down with Guizot!' Calm, undisturbed, stony in aspect, though strangely pallid, he entered and took his seat. Monsieur Vavin, deputy for the Seine, instantly mounted the tribune. As deputy of Paris, he had, he said, a solemn duty to fulfill. For 24 hours Paris had been in insurrection. Why was this? He called on the Minister of the Interior to explain. "And what said Guizot?" asked Louis Blanc eagerly. "He said he thought the public interest did not demand, nor was it proper for the Chamber at that time, to enter into debate on the subject. The King had called M. le Comte Mole to form a new cabinet." "And then the left cheered?" exclaimed Flocon. "Most emphatically," was the reply. "And what said Guizot then?" asked Ledru Rollin. "He calmly said that no such demonstrations could induce him to add to or withhold a single syllable of what he designed to say, or to pretermit a single act he had designed to do. As long as his ministry remained in office, he should cause public order to be respected according to his best judgment, and as he had always done. He should consider himself answerable for all that might happen, and should in all things act as conscience might dictate for the best interests of the country." "A noble answer!" exclaimed M. Dantes with enthusiasm. Ledru Rollin and Louis Blanc assented. "And what next?" pursued Flocon. "After considerable confusion," continued Lamartine, "M. Odillon Barrot rose and demanded, in consequence of the situation of the cabinet, a postponement of the proposition for its impeachment, fixed for tomorrow." "Ah, and what said the Chamber?" asked Flocon. "The demand was so loudly reprobated that M. Barrot immediately said he made the proposal in entire submission to the majority." "And what said Dupin?" asked Ledru Rollin eagerly. "Dupin said the first thing necessary for the capital was order. Anarchy must cease. The ministry could not at the same time occupy themselves in re-establishing order and in caring for their own safety. He demanded the adjournment of the impeachment and of all business." "And what did Barrot reply to that?" asked Louis Blanc. Monsieur Barrot was silent. The Minister of Foreign Affairs at once rose and said with much energy that as long as his cabinet remained entrusted with the public interest, which would probably be for some hours, it would cause the laws to be respected. The cabinet saw no reason for the suspension of the labors of the Chamber. The Crown was at that moment exercising its prerogative, and it must be respected. So long as his cabinet was on those benches, the Chamber need not suspend its labors. What was the vote on the question to postpone consideration of the impeachment? Asked Flocon. Some of the opposition supported the motion, but the whole centre opposed it, and it was lost. The Chamber immediately rose in great agitation, and M. Guizot disappeared. It seems to me that the position of M. Odillon Barrot is a somewhat peculiar one at this moment, observed Louis Blanc. He is neither with the Crown nor with the people, and yet both seem to confide in him. As I passed his house this evening at about 8 o'clock, said Flocon, a large multitude were in his courtyard shouting, Long live Odillon Barrot! A deputation of the people penetrated, I understand, even to his private apartment, where he was in consultation with Thiers and Dupin. Barrot then urged them to be moderate in their triumph and to retire. M. Garnier-Page, who chanced to be there, urged them to do the same, and they went off shouting louder than ever. At that moment, one of the reporters of Le National hastily entered and handed Marrast a note. "Whence do you come, monsieur?" asked the editor. "From the Tuileries, monsieur," was the reply, and the reporter left. The editor opened the note and read aloud. 1 o'clock, Count Mole, unable to form a cabinet, has this moment resigned, and the king has sent for Monsieur Guizot, Monsieur Thiers, and Marshal Bugeaud. 1:30 o'clock, Marshal Bugeaud's commission, as commander-in-chief of the National Guard and of the troops of the line, in place of Generals Jacques Minot and Peronnet Tiburce Sebastiani, has just been signed by Monsieur Guizot and his colleagues, the Ministers of War and the Interior, and will appear in the Moniteur of this morning. Bugeaud's plan is this: instant attack, with an overwhelming force of artillery, cavalry, and infantry of the line, which, he asserts, he has now already in position in anticipation of this event, and well disposed to act on all the barricades. He promises to sweep away every obstruction from the streets before dawn, though at the cost of 50,000 lives. "Ha!" exclaimed all the conspirators, instantly springing to their feet. "This, indeed, is resistance," said M. Dantès. "But Bugeaud can concentrate no more troops upon us. Every avenue to Paris will be effectually closed before morning, and even the telegraph stopped." "If this be true, we have not an instant to lose," said Louis Blanc. "I had a hint of this," began M. Dantès. Stay, messieurs!" cried Marrast, as the whole company was rushing to the door. "Here is another and later dispatch. 2 o'clock, Marshal Bugeaud has gone to complete his arrangements for instant attack. Monsieur Thiers has arrived, and with Odillon Barrot, de Vergier de Haran, and de Rémusat has formed a cabinet. General Lamoricière supersedes Marshal Bugeaud. The latter is recalled and forbidden to fire on the people. He protests with violence and sheathes his sword in despair." "To be sure he does, the old cut-throat!" cried Ledru Rollin. The idea of being let loose with his mastiffs on the people of Paris, like sheep pent up in a fold, was to him a source of rapturous anticipation, and his rage at the disappointment is proportional. "Messieurs," cried M. Dantès, "this last step of the government was all that we required to ensure our success. Thiers and Barrot mistake if they think there is sufficient magic in their names to quell a revolution. In fact, neither of them are trusted by the people. It is too late. Yesterday this might have been done, but now the demand is not reform, but a republic, not down with the ministry, but down with the dynasty." The conspirators looked at each other and then at M. Dantès in amazement and doubt. It was apparent they were as yet unprepared for language so plain. "M. Dantès is right," cried Flocon. "To-morrow night when we meet we shall all admit it." It was now nearly 3 o'clock, and the Republicans repaired to their homes for a few hours' sleep before the exciting scenes anticipated for the morrow. As Louis Blanc and M. Albert passed up the Rue Lepelletier and came opposite the hôtel of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, which but a few hours before had been the scene of so much confusion and bloodshed, they paused and looked around. The pavement was still dark and wet with the gore of the slaughtered citizens, but the whole street was deserted and silent. Here and there a solitary light might be detected in the attic windows of the immense hotel, but no other sign of life or human occupation was to be perceived. True, there was an ominous sound of rising barricades in the boulevard beyond, the crash of trees, the click of steel on stone, the lumbering of wheels, and at intervals a distant shout. But this accepted, all was as quiet in Paris as if the old city had never known of insurrection. "This spot will be noted in the future history of France," said Louis Blanc. "Do you know the exact facts of the case, Monsieur Albert? There are so many rumors that we can with difficulty get near the truth." "I was not present when the 14th delivered their fire," was the reply, "but I learned from Monsieur de Courtais, who hastened to the spot, that the colonel of the regiment now in prison asserts that at the moment of the arrival of the crowd a ball from a musket which accidentally went off broke the leg of his horse, and he, thinking this the signal for an attack, at once gave orders to fire. Another story is that one of our young blouses blew out an officer's brains with a pistol." "Many of the troops must have fired in the air," said Louis Blanc, looking around him, "for there were 200 of them in line, I understand, and their discharge was delivered across the whole breadth of the boulevard swarming with people." "It was unfortunate for Monsieur Guizot," rejoined Monsieur Albert, with a sardonic smile, "that his hotel should have witnessed such a scene." "But fortunate for the cause, nevertheless," replied Louis Blanc. "This last movement is called the movement of the journalists, I understand." "If suspicions are always as correct," said Monsieur Albert, "there will be fewer false ones, I fancy." Louis Blanc made no reply, and the friends walked on up the boulevard, reconnoitering every spot. At the Rue du Faubourg Montmartre they were stopped by a barricade which was rapidly rising under the united and vigorous exertions of several hundred men. Steadily, sternly, and silently all that night they toiled, and when the barricade was completed the tricolor flag was planted on its summit, and a citizen soldier stood beside its staff to defend it. On the other side of the boulevard, in the Rue Montmartre, rose another barricade entirely finished. "These men are resolved," said Louis Blanc. "Desperate, rather," replied Albert. "They have counted the cost, and prepared to go on with the attempt they have begun at all hazards. It is better to fight than starve, they think." "But do you observe how few of them are armed?" asked Louis Blanc. "We have provided for that deficiency. You will see arms enough for all tomorrow," replied Albert. "Barricades first, arms afterwards." And indeed, while he was yet speaking, a tumbril loaded with arms of every description drove silently up, and each man supplied himself with a weapon that suited his fancy. In some instances the taste exhibited was ludicrous in the extreme. There were swords without scabbards and bayonets without guns, a towering helmet on the head of one man, and broad white leather cross-belts on the shoulders of another. Daggers and knives, sabres and pikes mingled in grotesque confusion, but each individual was armed with something, and to crown all, a small piece of ordnance borne on the shoulders of 4 stout men who staggered beneath its weight was now brought up and placed in battery. "From such men what may we not hope?" exclaimed Louis Blanc. "But it is near morning. Let us proceed." "I stop here," quietly said Albert. "What? Pass the night here?" exclaimed his companion. "The night is nearly past now," replied Albert, with a smile. "I will sleep a few hours with my men of the barricades, and be ready to help them defend their work in the morning." "You are devoted to the cause, Albert," said Louis Blanc, warmly grasping his hand. "Oh, no more than yourself," was the reply. "We are all devoted to it, but each in his own way. You are an author, I am a workman. It is a light thing for me to pass a night with only the sky for a canopy. It is a light thing for you to pass a night in your study. A change of positions would possibly kill us both." The friends grasped each other warmly by the hand and parted, the author going to his study and the workman to his barricade. End of section 22. Section 23 of Edmond Dantes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Edmond Dantes by Edmund Flagg. Chapter 21. The Third Day. The next morning the following placard attracted general attention. Citizens of Paris, orders have been given to cease firing everywhere. We have just been charged by the King to form a new ministry. The Chamber will be dissolved and an appeal made to the country. General Lamoricière has been appointed Commandant of the National Guard. Liberty, order, union, reform. Odillon Barrot, Thiers. Such was the placard which appeared at every corner in Paris on the morning of Thursday, February 24th. At 3 o'clock it had been hastily struck at the offices of La Presse and Le Constitutionnel, and given into the hands of the bill-posters. At daylight it was read by the early passers, and as soon as read, indignantly torn down with the significant murmur, "It is too late." At 8 o'clock a proclamation to the National Guard, signed by Lamoricière and countersigned by Odillon Barrot, was similarly received. At 9 o'clock the 45th Regiment of the line fraternized with the National Guard, the 30th resigned its arms to the people, and the 5 companies of Compiers yielded their quarters with all their arms and ammunition at the first summons. At 10 o'clock a proclamation was posted up at the Bourse, signed by Odillon Barrot and Thiers, ordering the troops not only to cease firing, but to retire to their quarters. Immediately the trumpets sounded a retreat, and the most important positions hitherto held by the line were yielded to the people. The men of the barricades could now concentrate and advance. Magic there was none in the names of Barrot and Thiers to restrain them. Both were viewed as deserters from their cause. The latter was openly insulted by the populace wherever he appeared, and the former, though at first respectfully listened to, was at length assailed with murmurs of disapprobation on his way to the Tuileries. In his editorial sanctum sat our friend Beauchamp, of whom for some time we have lost sight, but who has, meanwhile, been most industriously at work in his paper Le Charivari, in concert with Le National and other larger sheets, in forwarding the cause of reform and finally of revolution. The door opened and Château Renaud appeared. "Farewell, Beauchamp," he exclaimed. "I've not a moment to lose. A post-chaise is at the door. Farewell." "Off!" cried the journalist in astonishment. "And whither, and why?" "Yes, off for England, Italy, America, anywhere but France," exclaimed the young noble. "And why?" "Why?" cried the indignant Deputy. "Look around you, and then ask what there is left in France for me. Beauchamp," continued the young man hurriedly and in low tones, "France will have no king at this hour to-morrow. Mark the prophecy. The National Guard fraternizes with the populace. The line fraternizes with the Guard. The government is, of course, paralyzed. All is over. 6 hours hence the Tuileries will be ransacked by a drunken mob. Farewell." "One moment. Why do you leave in this way? Why do you not go to Boulogne by the cars?" "And do you not know, you, a journalist, that for 3 leagues around, in every direction, every railway radiating from Paris has been torn up? Do you not know that every public conveyance, even to the mail diligences, has been stopped, and that all the telegraph stations have been dismantled, all to prevent the further concentration of troops in Paris by the government?" "I did hear of this, indeed," said Beauchamp. "At dawn I was at the railway depot, having late last night with extreme difficulty procured a passport, and whom, think you, among crowds of others I encountered there, you would never guess, and I haven't time for you to try, Lucien Debray, and with him, but that's impossible for you to divine, she who was Madame Danglars, wife of the rich banker years ago. Well, the banker is dead, and she is immensely rich, and I suppose Lucien's spouse into the bargain. And where go they? Oh, to England, of course, that grand reservoir of all emigrant royalists, that asylum for all who love kings. But farewell, farewell! If I'm not off soon, I may have to go without my head, and if you are not massacred by your detestable party, I hope to hear of you yet as a cabinet minister. Despite your abominable principles, you have my best wishes. Farewell!" And with a hearty shake of Beauchamp's hand, the young noble was off for an atmosphere more congenial to monarchists than was that of Paris. Nor was he alone. Thousands fled from Paris in like manner that same day, and the only cry that followed them was this: "Let them go! Let them go!" The streets of Paris were now choked with barricades, not the mere temporary breastworks of the first and second days, which a single charge of heavy dragoons would sweep away, but regular, systematic, scientific structures, erected apparently under the direction of military engineers, and calculated upon every principle of art to ensure resistance. Some of them were of immense size, that, for example, at the corner of the Rue Richelieu, some had portholes from which protruded the mouths of ordnance in battery. All were surmounted by a flag, tricolor or red, and all were defended by desperate men. Some other thoroughfares were crossed by many barricades, the Rue de Saint-Martin, for instance, by 30 or 40. The troops assailing these structures were mowed down throughout the day in a manner which even their opponents deemed most merciless. Instances of individual bravery on both sides were frequent. In the Rue Mauconseil, a young man exposed himself on the top of the barricade time after time, firing with fatal aim, and every time a shower of balls from the troops assailing whistled around him. But he stood untouched, and at length the officer, ordering the troops to fire at him no more, he retired at once behind the breastwork. A boy in the Rue Saint-Honoré mounted the barricade, enveloped in a tricolor flag, and dared the troops to fire on their colors. He descended unharmed. An officer of the line was summoned to yield his sword. He did so, but first broke it in twain across his knee. The same demand was made to a lieutenant of the municipal guard with a musket at his breast. He was bidden also to shout "Vive la République," but he only cried "Vive le Roi," as the weapon was wrenched from his grasp. Yet he was spared. Arms were demanded from every householder, and when given, the gift was endorsed on the door in these words: "Here we were given arms." One man received a sword splendidly decorated with gems upon its scabbard and hilt. "I want only the blade," he said, tearing it away from its ornaments and grasping the naked steel. At 10 o'clock, M. Odillon Barrot, General Lamoricière, and Horace Vernet, the great marine artist, proceeded on horseback to the barricades to induce the people to disperse, but all their eloquent entreaties were received only with insults. No truce, no tricks, no mistake this time were the decisive shouts with which they were greeted. A second time in the Rue Richelieu, General Lamoricière, accompanied by Moline Saint-Gru, bearing a palm branch, was equally unsuccessful. "It is too late," was the terrible response from the heart of the barricades, followed by a shower of stones, one of which wounded General Lamoricière on the hand. A third time in the Rue Rohan, General Gourgaud, who even promised the abdication of the king, met with the same utter defeat, and hastily fled from the fury of the monster, now thoroughly roused. At 12 o'clock the rumor sped with lightning rapidity through the streets of Paris that the troops, who had ostensibly been ordered to their quarters, were in fact concentrated around the palace. Instantly rose the shout, "To the Tuileries! To the Tuileries!" and 100,000 men from all sections of the city marched toward the Palais Bourbon and the Tuileries. The rumor of the concentration at the palace was true. The Place du Carrousel was crowded with troops of every arm, including several squadrons of cuirassiers, and 6 pieces of ordnance were in position with their ammunition caissons and their provisions and baggage wagons, as if for a siege. The king, attended by his staff and accompanied by the Dukes of Nemours and Montpensier, now descended into the court to pass the troops in review. The line shouted "Vive le Roi" as the king rode along. The National Guards, with tones and looks of menace and defiance, cried "Reform!" The king replied, "Yes, my friends, you shall have reform," and sad and dispirited turned away to his apartments. As he retired, the bitter murmur was heard from his aged lips, like Charles X. A deputation of the people had been admitted within the limits of the Place du Carrousel to announce the terms they would accept, but after a brief parley had retired dissatisfied. The men of the barricades now invested the Tuileries and the Palais Royal on every side. Such was the scene without. Within, all was confusion and dismay. The salons were thronged by deputies, peers, generals, and marshals. Bugeaud, Lamoricière, Dupin, Thiers, de Lasteyrie, and many others were there, together with all of the royal family then in the capital, whether male or female. Meanwhile, the rattle of musketry, broken by the occasional roar of ordnance in the direction of the Palais Royal, indicated the severe struggle then going on between the people and the troops. From time to time, the furious shout of "To the guillotine with Louis Philippe" reached the ear. "Does your Majesty hear that?" asked the Duke of Nemours coldly of his dismayed father. Alas, the old man was no longer the hero of July 3rd. "I do, my son," was the trembling reply. "Do you advise abdication?" "Is there any other course left?" asked the Duke of Montpensier. "Any other course?" cried the Queen indignantly. "Oh, are you my son? Are you a son of Orléans? And can you talk thus of degradation? Are you a soldier, and do you fear? Mount, mount, charge on the rebels, cut them to the earth, drench the pavement with their blood, perish, but yield not ignominiously thus." "Madame," said Monsieur Thiers solemnly, "it is too late. There must be an abdication in favor of the Count of Paris and the appointment of the Duchess of Orléans as regent, or all is lost." "Then if this must be, let it be done with dignity becoming a monarch," said the noble Queen. "Let us all retire to Saint Cloud. There may be dictated terms of honorable capitulation. There—" At that instant in rushed a man, breathless, bearing a sheet of paper in his hand, and exclaiming, "Sire, sire, your troops are delivering their arms to the people. In a moment they will stand where you now stand. Sign this paper, or your life and the lives of all your family will be sacrificed." That man was Émile de Girardin, the editor of La Presse and the murderer of Armand Carrel, and that paper was an act of abdication. "Ah, this is a bitter cup," said the old King, as he placed his signature to the sheet, "and doubly bitter presented by such a hand like Charles X." At 1 o'clock at the Bourse and at the corners of all the principal streets was posted this proclamation: "Citizens of Paris, the King has abdicated in favor of the Count of Paris, with the Duchess of Orléans as regent. A general amnesty, dissolution of the Chamber, appeal to the country." But the people were now in the midst of the assault on the Palais Royal, and to check them was impossible. The Palais Royal consisted of two portions, the Château d'Eau, or palace, and the other part, which, though the property of the Orléans family, was yet rented by private persons, and was occupied for cafés, shops, dwellings, and places of entertainment, adorned by colonnades and arcades, and by trees, statues, and fountains in the magnificent quadrangle. The property of the citizens was respected, that of the King only was assailed. For 2 hours did the 14th Regiment pour forth its fire from the numerous windows of that edifice and from the court below. At length a band of bold republicans, headed by the chivalric Etienne Arago, musket in hand, charged from the side of the Café de la Régence, followed by a detachment of the National Guard, and driving the troops into the building, surrounded it with straw, which they set on fire. The vast edifice was instantly filled with smoke and flame. The defence ceased. The soldiers rushed out and were instantly slain. The commander of the detachment was pierced by a bayonet. The multitude rushed in, and the building was sacked. The richest and most costly furniture and decorations were at once torn down, dashed to pieces, and thrown from the windows by the infuriated populace. Within the palace of the Tuileries is a subterranean passage constructed for the infant King of Rome and his nurses, which, plunging beneath the pavements and passing along the whole length of the gardens under the terrace beside the river bank, suddenly emerges at the gate of the Place du Carrousel in front of the obelisk. Into this passage, in wild panic, descended the King and Queen of France, with all their children and grandchildren, immediately upon the signing of the abdication, and just as the doors were about to be forced. Emerging from the passage, the King, leaning on the arm of his faithful wife, Marie Amélie, and followed by the royal party, crossed the Place de la Concorde as far as the asphalt pavement. The royal party now consisted of the King and Queen, the Duchess of Nemours and her children, the Princess Clémentine and her husband, the Duke of Augustus of Saxe-Coburg, and the Duke of Montpensier, with his young and lovely Spanish bride, now enceinte and far advanced. Ignorant of the language, only 16 years of age, a stranger to the customs and people of the country, and in her delicate situation, the position of this young creature was peculiarly trying. At one moment she clung with terror to her young husband's arm, which she refused for an instant to resign, and the next laughed at her own terror, saying that one who in her infancy had twice in Madrid been saved by being carried off in a sack ought not now to fear when she had feet to carry herself away and was suffered to use them. It is said that the fair signora was forgotten in the hurry of the flight and almost left behind. As soon as the royal party were perceived, they were surrounded by a troop of National Guards as an escort, and a large number of officers of the line in various uniforms. The King leaned on the Queen as if for support, while she boldly advanced with a firm step and stern look. Both were in deepest mourning for the recent death of the beloved sister of the King, the Princess Adelaide. Upon this melancholy procession the people gazed with mingled curiosity, amusement, gratification, and regret. "They are going to the Chamber of Deputies to complete the abdication," cries one. "Vive la Réforme!" shouts another. "Vive la France!" shouts a second. "Vive la Roi!" in suppressed tones falters a third. "See the poor young Duchess!" cried a woman who was availing herself of her peculiar rotundity as a battering ram to force her way through the crowd. "She had better have remained at home," sneered a dynastic bitterly. "The poor little children!" exclaimed a young woman, more remarkable for prettiness than neatness, and more remarkable still for the scantiness of her attire, nearly all of which had been torn from her rounded shoulders in the throng. The spirit which pervaded the mass was evidently by no means unfriendly to the royal family, and it was as evidently misunderstood by them, for suddenly, as if by fatality, on the very spot where Louis XVI was beheaded, just beyond the Pont Tournant, on the pavement of the obelisk of Luxor, the whole party, with no apparent necessity, came to a dead and complete halt. Instantly the multitude was crowded upon them, and this augmented their terror. The King dropped the Queen's arm, and hastily raising his hat, cried, "Vive la Réforme!" All was in a moment uproar and confusion. The Queen, in terror at finding her husband's arm was gone, turned hurriedly on every side. "Fear not, madame," said a mild voice beside her. "The people will do you no harm." This was Monsieur Maurice, editor of La Courrier des Spectacles. Leave me, monsieur," she exclaimed in great excitement, evidently mistaking the words. Then, regaining her husband, she again grasped his arm, and the mass at the same time opening its ranks, the two hastened on to a couple of those little black one-horse vehicles, chancing there to stand, which run to Saint-Cloud. In one of these already sat the Duchesses of Montpensier and Nemours, with two of the children. In the other stood the two remaining children. Into the latter hurriedly stepped the royal pair. The door was instantly closed, and the vehicle drove off at a furious rate, surrounded by an escort of dragoons, cuirassiers, and National Guards, 200 in number, taking the water side towards Saint-Cloud. The other carriage, similarly escorted, followed at a like rapid pace, the children standing at the windows, their faces pressed to the glass, gazing eagerly with the innocent curiosity of infancy on a scene from which their future fate would take shape. "He is gone!" shouted a stentorian voice, breaking the momentary stillness as the carriages surrounded by their escort swept from the view. "Let him go! Let him go!" was the stern and significant response. "We are not regicides!" "To the Tuileries! To the Tuileries!" was now the tremendous shout which rose from the multitude as they rushed toward the deserted palace. But the Tuileries had already fallen. It was no longer the dwelling place of kings. Even before the royal abdication was declared, even before it was signed, the troops of the line in the courtyard of the palace, infantry, artillery, dragoons, to the number at least of 25,000, were summoned to surrender their posts, while the fraternal shout "Vive la Ligne" elicited from the lips of many of the soldiers the answering cry of "Vive la Réforme." In vain was it that Marshal Bugeaud, the veteran of 100 battles, menaced and blasphemed. In vain did his old protégé and subaltern, but now bitter foe, General Lamoricière, dashing from one end of the line to the other on his white horse, entreat and persuade with his eloquent tongue. The people insisted, the National Guard fraternized, the line wavered, and yet most imminent at that moment was their own peril. The 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 6th, and 10th Legions of the National Guard invested the Tuileries, and others were on the march, accompanied by countless masses of the people. Within the courtyard were 25,000 of the best troops in the world of every arm, and a park of ordnance charged to the muzzle frowned upon the dense masses which swarmed the Place du Carrousel. The watchful artilleryman stood at his cannon's breech, with the lighted linstock in his hand, which he kept alive by constant motion. He awaited but a word from the pale, firm lips of General Lamoricière, and that vast and magnificent space, now swarming with life, would have been swept as if by destruction's besom. Death in all its most horrid forms would have been there. That pavement would have run with gore. The façades of those splendid edifices would have been polluted with shreds and fragments of human flesh and spattered with human blood. Yet dreadful would have been the sure retribution, indiscriminate massacre of all unfortunate souls within that royal palace would have been inevitable and instantaneous. Yet such a catastrophe might be precipitated by a single word. The avalanche might be started by a single breath, and blood once shed, Paris would be deluged. "In the name of the people, I demand to speak with the commandant of the Tuileries," shouted a young man in the uniform of an officer of the National Guard, advancing to the iron railing of the court near the Rue de Rivoli. It was Lieutenant Aubert Roche. The commandant was sent for and immediately arrived. "Monsieur, you are lost!" cried the young man. "You are surrounded by 60,000 men of the National Guard and 100,000 of the people of Paris." "What is demanded?" was the trembling response. "That you evacuate the Tuileries. Resign it to the National Guard." "The troops shall be withdrawn, monsieur. Orders for their retirement to the palace shall be issued instantly." "That will not do. The palace must be evacuated," insisted the lieutenant, "or the people will raze it to the ground." "Come with me, monsieur," said the commandant. The gate was immediately opened, and Lieutenant Roche, accompanied by Monsieur le Sieur, chef de bataillon, bearing a flag of truce, followed the commandant to the Pavillon de l'Horloge, where stood the Duke of Nemours, pale with excitement, surrounded by generals. "Monseigneur," said the commandant, "suffer me to present a deputation from the people." "Messieurs, what do the people demand?" asked the Duke in trembling tones. "The evacuation this instant of this palace and its delivery to the National Guard." "And if we do not comply?" asked Marshal Bugeaud calmly. "Then, monsieur, you are all lost," was the bold answer. "This palace is surrounded by 160,000 men. The combat once begun must be exterminating, must be a massacre. The 5th Legion of the National Guard, to which I belong, is at this moment sacking the Palais Royal. It may be here before we part." "The troops shall retire, monsieur," said the Duke, and on the instant orders for the retreat were issued. The artillery went by the railing of the palace, and the staff and the Duke of Nemours by the Pavillon de l'Horloge, their well-trained horses descending the flight of steps. The cavalry followed, succeeded by the infantry. The National Guards were then introduced by Lieutenant Roche, and entered the court of the Tuileries by the gate of the Rue de Rivoli, their muskets shouldered with the stock in the air. At the same moment the abdication of the King was declared. General Lamoricière had resigned. The ministry was dissolved. There was a tremendous shout, and the conquerors of the Palais Royal rushed in to take possession of the Tuileries. End of section 23. Section 24 of Edmond Dantes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Edmond Dantes by Edmund Flagg. Chapter 22. The last session of the Chamber of Deputies. The usual hour for the opening of the Chamber of Deputies was 3 o'clock, but the startling events of the last 2 days, and especially of the last 2 hours, demanded that it should be convened earlier. At 1 o'clock the president of the Chamber, Sauzet, took the chair. On the left bank of the Seine all the approaches were open, save the bridges of the Place de la Concorde, where strong detachments of cavalry were posted on guard. Within the Chamber all was solemnity. About 300 members were present. The opposition seemed joyous and confident, though anxious. The Conservative party was troubled. The ministerial benches were deserted. At 1:30 the president turned round in his chair and kept his eye fixed upon a side door, as if expecting some one to enter. Suddenly a bustle was heard in that direction, and the Duchess of Orléans, in deep mourning, attended by her 2 sons and followed by the Dukes of Montpensier and Nemours, entered. The latter was received with marked expressions of dislike. The Count of Paris, garbed in complete black, was conducted through the crowd to the space in front of the president's chair. The Duchess followed and seated herself in a fauteuil upon the same spot. On each side of her was one of her sons, and behind her stood her brothers, the Dukes of Nemours and Montpensier. This position was subsequently changed for one more distant, but otherwise remained throughout relatively the same. Being seated, the Duchess rose and bowed repeatedly to the assembly. At the same moment an immense multitude of National Guards and the people rushed in through the passages, and despite the shouts of the officers, "You cannot enter," the space beneath the tribune was instantly and densely thronged. At the same time the public tribunes were invaded by a second body of the people. For some minutes the greatest uproar prevailed. At length it comparatively ceased, and in a moment of quiet M. Dupin, who had accompanied the Duchess of Orléans to the Chamber, ascended the tribune. The stillness was instantly as great as had been the previous agitation. "The King has abdicated," said M. Dupin. "The Count of Paris is nominated as his successor, and the Duchess of Orléans as regent." "It is too late!" shouted a man from the gallery of the people. "The Count of Paris is proclaimed king by the Chamber, and the Duchess of Orléans regent!" exclaimed the president. "No, no, no!" was the almost unanimous shout that now rose in the Chamber. "I demand," cried M. Lamartine, "that the royal family withdraw." The question was put, and the Duchess and her sons, after great hesitation, were drawn away to a side door at the further end of the hall. At the same moment a new crowd of the people rushed in and took seats beside the opposition members, by whom they were welcomed. "I demand to speak," cried M. Marie. "By the law of 1842 the Duke of Nemours is regent. How can the King abrogate that law? I demand a provisional government." "A provisional government!" cried M. Crémieux. "We made a mistake in '30. Let there be no mistake in '48." "A provisional government," said the Abbé Genoude, a Legitimist, "but it must be the will of the people." M. Odillon Barrot, who had been long expected, now entered and immediately mounted the tribune. "The crown of July rests on the head of a woman and a child," cried the great lawyer. The Duchess of Orléans instantly rose, as if about to speak, but at the urgent solicitation of those around her, resumed her seat. "I call on the country to rally around this woman and this child," cried M. Barrot, the twofold representative of the principles of July 30. The voice of the speaker was drowned in shouts of dissent and of "Vive la Réforme!" "I dissent from the opinion of M. Odillon Barrot," cried the Marquis de la Rochejacquelin. "If he is right, the people are nothing." "Order! Order!" cried the president, putting on his hat, but he was at once induced to remove it. At this moment another vast crowd burst into the chamber, garbed in a style so heterogeneous as to be grotesque, some with blouses, some with dragoon helmets on their heads, some with weapons, and many with flags. "Down, down, down with the throne!" was the terrible cry of this infuriated mass. "I demand that the sitting be suspended!" cried M. de Mornay. "There can be no session at such a moment," said the president, putting on his hat. "Off, off, off with your hat, president!" cried the populace, and several of their muskets were at once pointed at the president. The hat was removed. The scene was chaos. "Beware!" shouted M. Chevalier, editor of the Historical Library, "beware how you make the Count of Paris king. A provisional government we must first have." "What right have you to speak?" shouted a man. "You are not a deputy." "In the name of the people!" "Silence!" roared a terrific voice that drowned every other. It was the voice of Ledru Rollin. Many of the deputies now withdrew, and their places were filled by the people. The Duchess of Orléans sat calmly amid the uproar, and the Duke of Nemours, with equal calmness, stood behind her chair. "The throne has been tumbled from the windows of the Tuileries and is now burning in the Place de la Bastille," cried M. Dumoulin, who commanded the Hôtel de Ville in July of '30, displaying the tricolor flag. "No more Bourbons! Down with the Bourbons! Down with the traitors! A provisional government!" shouted the people. "Aye, a republic!" cried M. Chevalier. Crémieux, Ledru Rollin, and Lamartine were at the same time in the tribune. "In the name of the people, silence!" again roared the awful voice of Ledru Rollin. "A provisional government!" shouted one of the people. "You shall have a provisional government!" exclaimed M. Maguin. "In the name of the people, in the name of the people of Paris, in arms!" again began Ledru Rollin. "I protest against this king and this regency. The Constitution of '9 demands the will of the people to fix a regency, yet the law of '42 makes the Duke of Nemours regent, and now it is the Duchess of Orléans. I protest against it all. I demand a provisional government." "Question! Question!" shouted M. Berryer. "A provisional government!" "In 1815," continued Ledru Rollin, "Napoleon abdicated in favor of the King of Rome. The King of Rome was refused. In 1830, Charles X abdicated in favor of his grandson. The grandson was rejected. In 1848, Louis Philippe abdicates in favor of his grandson, the Count of Paris." "Question! Question!" again vociferated M. Berryer. "We all know those histories." "In the name of the people," continued Ledru Rollin, "I demand a provisional government named by the people, not by the Chamber, but by the people." Tremendous shouts followed, and M. Lamartine, who had stood beside Rollin in the tribune, now took his place amid renewed shouts. After an eloquent speech on the same side as his friend, he concluded by demanding a provisional government, with an appeal to the people, the entire people, all who by the title of man have rights as men. While Lamartine was yet speaking, a violent knocking was heard at the door of the Chamber, which was forcibly burst open, and a vast crowd rushed in. "Down with the Chamber! Down with the Deputies!" shouted the populace, and muskets were instantly levelled at Lamartine and also at the royal party. "It is Lamartine! It is Lamartine!" was the cry of terror that rose from his friends. The muskets were lowered. The Duchess and her party were at once withdrawn from the Chamber by a side door, and having first retired to the Hôtel des Invalides, next fled to the Rhine. The Duke of Nemours fled to Boulogne, and thence to England. "Silence! Silence! Silence!" shouted the President, violently ringing his bell, but the uproar only increased. "I pronounce this session closed!" cried the President, and putting on his hat, he instantly left the chair. Here ends the Chamber of Deputies. A large number of the members withdrew with the President, but the opposition remained, and with them the people and the National Guards. After the noise incident to this departure had subsided, the venerable M. Dupont de l'Eure, a gray-headed old man of 80, was by unanimous acclamation placed in the President's chair. Lamartine still remained in the tribune and repeatedly strove to make his voice heard, but in vain. "In the name of the people, silence, and let Lamartine speak!" at length was heard in the thunder tones of Ledru Rollin, rising above all other sounds. Silence for a moment being obtained, Lamartine exclaimed: "Citizens, a provisional government is declared. The names of the members will now be announced by the President." Lamartine then descended from the tribune. Applause and uproar succeeded. "The names of the members nominated for a provisional government I will now read to you," said the aged President, rising and displaying a paper. The following names were then read, and were repeated as they came one after the other from the speaker's mouth by the reporters in loud tones: Lamartine, Ledru Rollin, Arago, Dupont de l'Eure, Marie, Georges Lafayette. All were received with general approbation. "The members of the provisional government must be conducted by the people to the Hôtel de Ville and installed," cried a voice from the crowd. "Let us adjourn to the Hôtel de Ville, Lamartine at the head," said M. Bocage. Immediately Lamartine, accompanied by a large number of citizens, withdrew, but a great multitude still remained upon the benches and in the semicircle of the Chamber. "Citizens," cried Ledru Rollin, "in nominating a provisional government you perform a solemn act, an act which cannot be performed in a furious manner. Let me once more repeat to you the names you have chosen, and as they are repeated you will say yes or no, precisely as they please you. I call on the reporters of the public press to note the names and the manner in which they are now received, that France may know what is here done. The names of Dupont de l'Eure, Arago, Lamartine, Ledru Rollin, Crémieux, Garnier-Page, and Marie were then read out, and all except the last two, which were received with a few negatives, were confirmed by unanimous acclamation. The names were then engrossed in capitals on a sheet of paper and borne around the Chamber on the bayonet of a National Guard, that all might read for themselves. "I have one more word to say," cried Ledru Rollin. "The provisional government has immense duties to perform. We must now close this meeting, that the government may be able to restore order, stanch the flow of blood, and secure to the people their rights. To the Hôtel de Ville! To the Hôtel de Ville!" responded the people in a tremendous shout. "Vive la République! To the Hôtel de Ville!" Headed by Ledru Rollin, the excited multitude withdrew, and at 4 o'clock all was as silent in the Chamber of Deputies as if not a voice had resounded or a footstep had echoed within its walls for centuries. In the distance, however, could be heard the repeated shout, "Vive la République! To the Hôtel de Ville!" End of section 24. Section 25 of Edmond Dantes, This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Edmond Dantes by Edmund Flagg. Chapter 23, The Sack of the Tuileries. Scarcely had the carriages conveying the royal family disappeared on their flight towards Saint-Cloud, when the whole mass of the populace poured as with one simultaneous purpose into the deserted palace. The Palais Bourbon had already been sacked. A like fate might be supposed to await the Tuileries, but the Tuileries belonged to France, not to the House of Orléans, and a certain respect was observed for everything but the insignia of royalty. For these was shown no regard. The throne itself of the state reception-room, that throne on which sat Louis Philippe for the first time as King of the French, ere the Tuileries became his throne, was torn from its base, and having been hurled first in derision from the windows into the court, was borne in mock triumph on the shoulders of men who shouted that now the throne was indeed supported by the people, to the Place de la Bastille, and there consumed to ashes. In the courtyard in the Rue de Rivoli and on the quays, huge fires roared, fanned into fury by a hurricane of wind, and fed by richly carved furniture, gilded chairs, canopies, pianos, sofas, beds, costly paintings, splendid works of art, and the royal carriages glittering with gold. The magnificent tapestries of the Gobelins were borne as streamers in frantic fury along the boulevards. The mischievous gamins were frolicking about in the long scarlet robes worn upon court occasions, which they had filched from the royal wardrobe. The escritoire of the king, the key having been found in a teacup, was ransacked, and private letters, books, and the garments of ladies were strewn about the court and gardens of the Tuileries. The cellars of the palace were soon filled with the insurgents, but they declared the wine bad, as it never remained long enough in the cellars of kings to get good. Destruction, not pillage, seemed the order of the hour, and to guard against robbery the people took upon themselves the arrest and punishment of offenders. The walls bore the menace, "Robbers shall die." In several instances the threat was carried into immediate execution, and bodies, suffered to lie on the spot upon which they had been cut down, bore on their breasts the label "Thief," in terrible warning. Sentinels also stood at the gates, and no one was allowed to leave the palace without rigorous search. In the apartments of the Duchess of Orléans the table was found spread for the dinner of herself and her children. Upon the table were the little silver cups, forks, and spoons of the young princes, and on the floor were scattered their costly toys. The latter were gathered carefully up by a workman in a blouse, and as carefully concealed in a corner. The former, together with all jewels and other valuables found in the apartments of the Duchess, were deposited in a bathing tub, on which a workman seated himself as guard and suffered no one to approach until the aforesaid valuables could be conveyed by a detachment of the Polytechnic School to the government treasury. The story runs that on the night succeeding the sack of the Tuileries the conquerors chose a king and queen, and that in the palace hall was spread a banquet composed of the viands found in the royal kitchen and the wines found in the royal cellars. The queen, who was a soubrette more noticeable for beauty than for cleanliness of person, garbed in royal robes which she well became, and with a coronet upon her stately brow, was seated in a chair of state, and received the most extravagant homage from her willing subjects, while groups of gamins, in the long crimson liveries of the royal household, boisterously frolicked before the sans-culotte court amid roars of merriment. End of section 25.
Section 26 of Edmond Dantes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Castleberry, Detroit, Michigan. LarryCastleberry.com. Edmond Dantes by Edmund Flagg. Chapter 24, A Memorable Night. Generally, the rogues throughout Paris, intimidated by the awful, immediate, and certain penalty for crime, forsook for the time their calling. A man who attempted to fire the Palais Royal was shot at the prefecture. Another, for a like attempt on buildings in the Rue Monceau, met a like fate. In the Rue Chaillot lay the bodies of 2 thieves, each with a ball through the breast, and over the aperture the word thief on a label. In like manner were 8 more robbers executed at once on the Place des Madeleines. A woman of the street wrested a bracelet from a lady's wrist. She was instantly seized by the bystanders and shot. But for the summary punishment of malefactors by the people, dreadful that night would have been the state of Paris, without laws to enforce or a police to enforce them. It is true the Chateau of Neuilly was sacked and burned, as well as the splendid villa of the Baron Rothschild at Paris, but both were supposed to be the property of the king. It is true also that some rails on the Northern Railway were torn up, and a viaduct between Paris and Amiens and another between Amiens and the frontier of Belgium were demolished, and that the railway station at Saint-Denis-en-Guyenne and Pontoise and the bridge at Asnières had been destroyed. But all this was done to prevent the concentration upon the citizens of Paris of additional royal troops. A workman entered a house and demanded bread. Meat and wine were offered him. No, was the reply. Bread and water are all I want. Yet such was the scarcity of food that horses were killed and eaten at the Hôtel de Ville on the 3rd day of the Revolution. "Arms! Arms!" shouted a band of workmen, entering a house on the Rue Chaillot. The proprietor, alarmed, shouted for help. "Do you think us robbers?" was the indignant reply. "Give us your weapons." The weapons were given, and the band retired. On the door they wrote, "Here we received arms." At 5 o'clock on the evening of the 24th of February, a proclamation to the citizens of Paris issued by the provisional government then in session at the Hôtel de Ville declared the revolution accomplished, that 80,000 of the National Guard and 100,000 of the people were in arms, that order as well as liberty must now be secured, and the people, with the National Guard, were appointed guardians of Paris. The effect of this proclamation was magical. Never was Paris so well protected as on that night of the 24th of February, when, filled with barricades, she had no police and was guarded by her citizens. And how was constituted the provisional government, whose power was thus implicitly obeyed? It was founded by the people who obeyed it. This was the only secret. From the Chamber of Deputies to the Hôtel de Ville proceeded the members of the provisional government. They marched under a canopy of sabers, pikes, and bayonets into halls stained with blood and encumbered with the slain. And there, at a small table, while the conflict between the 2 republics had already commenced, within an hour had they organized their body by the nomination of Armand Marrast of La Nationale, Ferdinand Flocon of La Réforme, Albert, a workman, and Louis Blanc, the editor and author, as secretaries of the government. Their first official act was to issue a proclamation to the people. The scenes witnessed the night which succeeded in Paris would never be forgotten by those who witnessed them. Patrols promenaded the streets. The men of the barricades slept upon their weapons. Beside their works, and through all that night ceaselessly toiled the press to spread over all the world the news of the great events of the 3 past days in Paris. Upon the door of an edifice situated in the Rue Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a street which was filled with barricades of immense size and strength, was posted a printed placard. The provisional government, lighted by a single lamp, entering the door with a vast multitude, and ascending the dark and winding staircase, you found yourself in a large room, dimly lighted and crowded with armed men. It was the editorial apartment of the office of Les Réformés. At a large and massive table sat a dozen persons, most industriously employed in writing. Around them, looking on, rose the rough, stern faces of the men of the barricades, seeming still more rough and stern by reason of the shadowy light. In the hands of all were weapons. "A copy of the name of the members of the provisional government," was the incessant demand of these armed men, a demand which the dozen writers at the table were unable, even by most indefatigable industry, to supply as fast as made. And as fast as the demand was satisfied, the armed men would hurry away, only to leave the room for the crowds constantly entering. "A copy for the Hotel de Villa," cried one. "A copy for the Place Vendôme," shouted another. "A copy for the Palais Bourbon," screamed a third. "Are there no printed copies left?" asked many. "They were gone long ago. 20,000 copies," was the reply. "You will see one at every corner. The demand was not expected. The printers have just gone to sleep. They had not rested for 52 hours. "Will La Réforme appear in the morning?" asked another. "Perhaps so," was the answer. "But all the people are worn out, writers and compositors. Here is your copy of the names." "Many thanks. Vive la République!" With this shout, in concert with the same which constantly issued from 100 lips, the citizens folded up his precious document and, carefully depositing it in his cap, hurried off to communicate its contents to his comrades of the neighboring barricade. In another apartment of that same edifice were a large number of the Republican party connected with Les Réformés. "The provisional government is now in session," said one. "They will doubtless make immediate provision for departments of states so important as the post office and the prefecture of police. Early tomorrow a proclamation—" "Tomorrow may be too late," interrupted a large and muscular man. "The post office is more active than ever tonight. Every moment couriers are arriving and departing. That powerful instrument remains in the hands of the foes of our cause. Who may estimate the injury, the irreparable injury which they may this night accomplish by its means?" This man was Etienne Arago, brother of the great astronomer, and for 16 years celebrated as one of the boldest members of the Republican Party, as well as one of the bravest men in Paris. "In the prefecture of police," observed another, "the present utter derangement of all its functions may lead to most serious results. Already those foes of freedom, Gazut and his colleagues, have been suffered to secure their escape from the just indignation of an outraged people. De Lessert, the prefect, has also fled." The man who said this was Marc Cassidier, a well-known Republican. "Citizens," cried Monsieur Guachi, "this state of things must continue no longer. In the name of the people, I demand that Etienne Arago immediately assume the charge of the post office as its director, and that Marc Castier fill the position of prefect." This demand was confirmed by acclamation, and committees for the installation of the nominees into office at once accompanied them to their respective departments. The immense edifice of the post office was surrounded by people, and its numerous windows were flashing with lights. Within the utmost activity seemed to prevail, and without couriers were leaving and arriving every moment, and mail coaches were dashing up to discharge their burdens, or, having received them, were dashing off. "In the name of the people, entrance for Citizen Etienne Arago, Republican Director of the Post Office," shouted one of the committee. Instantly, a passage through the immense crowd in the courtyard was cleared by the National Guard, and the director entered with his escort. "In the name of the people, Citizen Dijon, you are dismissed," said Etienne Arago, entering the private cabinet of the Director General. "And who is to be my successor?" said the astonished Count, rising to his feet. "In the name of the people, I am sent to displace and to succeed you," was the answer. "But your commission, monsieur?" "Is here," pointing to the committee. "Before I resign the direction of this department," said the Count after some hesitation, "I must ask of you for some record of this act, bearing your signature, to be deposited in the archives of the office." "Certainly, monsieur. Your request is but reasonable," answered Arago, seating himself in the official chair, and writing a few lines to which he affixed his signature. He coolly handed the document to his astonished predecessor. It contained notice of his own appointment by the people, in place of the Count d'Agen, dismissed. The Count read and folded the paper, and having made a copy of it, which he laid carefully in his porte-monnaie, he placed the original on file among the papers of the day belonging to the department. Then, courteously bowing, he took his hat and cane and marched out of the building. End of section 26. Recording by Larry Castleberry, Detroit, Michigan. LarryCastleberry.com.
Section 27 of Edmond Dantes, This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Edmond Dantes by Edmund Flagg, Chapter 25, The Provisional Government. In the Hôtel de Ville, closely closeted, sat the Provisional Government of France. Over that stern old citadel, over the dismantled palace of the Tuileries, from the tall summit of the column of Vendôme, over the Hôtel des Invalides, and in the Place de la Bastille, is seen a blood-red banner, streaming out like a meteor on the keen northwestern blast. 80,000 armed men invest the Hôtel de Ville, and wave on wave, wave on wave, the living and stormy tide eddies and welters and dashes around that dark old pile. All its avenues are held, its courts are thronged, ordnance frowns from its black portals, and against its gates drums roll, banners stream, bayonets glitter, and from those tens of thousands of hoarse and stormy voices goes up but one shout of menace and command. Vive la République, vive la République. No kings, no Bourbon. Down, down, forever with the kings. And upward to that dark old pile of despotism, as to the temple of liberty herself, are turned those tens of thousands of swarthy faces, dark with the smoke of battle, yet livid with excitement and exhaustion, and as they realize that within those walls the question of their fate and that of their country is then being settled, that from that night's councils in that vast and ancient edifice are to flow peace and prosperity and freedom and plenty, or else all the untold terrors of anarchy, civil war, bloodshed, violence, and strife. What wonder that the sitting of the councils seemed endless, and their own impatience became intolerable, that all imaginable doubts and fears and absurd apprehensions took possession of their inflamed imaginations, that at one time the rumor should fly, and win credence as it flew, that the Provisional Government were consulting with the friends of Henry V, or again that they were considering the question of a regency, and that under such influences they should roar and yell, and thunder for admission at the gates, and burden the air with their shouts. No Bourbon, no kings, no regency, death, death to all kings, la République, la République, la République. At times, in terrific concert, would the thousands of uplifted throats roar forth the chorus of that startling canticle of 92, Vive la République, vive la République, debout, peuple français, debout, peuple héroïque, debout, peuple français, vive la République. Then the song would change, and the mournful notes of the death hymn of the Girondins, Mourir pour la patrie, would swell in wild yet solemn cadence on the wintry blast. Death hymn of the Girondins. By the voice of the signal cannon, France calls her sons their aid to lend. Let us go, the soldier cries, to battle, 'tis our mother we defend. To die on freedom's altar, to die on freedom's altar, 'tis the noblest of fates, who to meet it would falter. We who fall afar from the battle, lone and unknown obscurely die, but give at least our parting blessings unto France and freedom high. To die on freedom's altar, to die on freedom's altar, 'tis the noblest of fates, who to meet it would falter. And thus all that terrible night, even until the morning's dawn, thronged those men of the barricades around the Hôtel de Ville, and all the night, even until the morning's dawn, calmly continued those men of the Provisional Government of the French Republic, amid menace and mandate, uproar and confusion in their noble yet arduous work. At midnight a proclamation of the provisional government was read by torchlight to the excited masses by Louis Blanc from the steps of the Hôtel de Ville, declaring for a government of the people by itself, with liberty, equality, and fraternity for its principles, while order was devised and maintained by the people, which served somewhat to allay their apprehensions and distrust. This proclamation appeared in all the morning journals and was placarded all over the city the next day. That day was Friday, the 25th of February, but still the provisional government remained in session, and still the armed masses of the barricades in congregated thousands rolled in tumultuous billows around the Hôtel de Ville. At length the populace, exasperated by impatience, hunger, and sleeplessness, with brandished bayonets rushed into the very chamber of council with furious cries and with threats which were well nigh accomplished. Again and again, at the entreaty of his colleagues, did the brave, the eloquent, the wise Lamartine present himself upon the steps of the Hôtel de Ville to assuage and quiet the rising tempest. Again and again throughout that fearful day did he come forth, single-handed, to wrestle with violence, turbulence, anarchy, and strife. And again, beneath the magic of his eloquent tongue, the storm lulled, the tempest ceased. Again and again, throughout all that fearful day, were the acts of that noble government matured and sent forth. Proclamation followed proclamation, and no branch of society seemed forgotten. The names of the members of the provisional government were again published. Caussidière and Sobrier were confirmed in the police department, and Etienne Arago in that of the post office. Merchants of provisions were recommended to supply all who were in need, and the people were recommended to still retain their arms. The Chamber of Deputies was dissolved, the peers were forbidden to meet, and the convocation of a National Assembly was promised. To all laborers, labor was guaranteed, and compensation for labor. At noon, the garrison of the fort of Vincennes was announced to have acknowledged the Republic, just as the people were about to march upon it. To ensure order and tranquillity, the municipal guard was disbanded, and the National Guard entrusted with the protection of Paris under Monsieur Courtet, the commandant, who was ordered immediately to recruit 24 battalions for active service. All articles pledged at the Mont de Piété from February 4th, not exceeding in value 10 francs, were ordered to be returned, and the Tuileries was decreed the future asylum of invalid workmen. An attack on the machinery of some of the printing offices was checked by a proclamation. General Bedeau was appointed Minister of War, General Cavaignac Governor of Algeria, and Admiral Baudin to the command of the Toulon fleet. On the part of the army, Marshal Bugeaud, and on the part of the clergy, the venerable Archbishop of Paris gave in their adhesion to the Republic, while the entire press, bourgeoisie, and the province hesitated not an instant. Indeed, from all quarters came in adhesions to the Republic. The Bonapartes were among the first. Barrot and Thiers also came, but too late to save themselves from contempt. Mr. Rush, the American minister, the first of foreign ambassadors, acknowledged the Republic. The son of Mehemet Ali was next. The papal nuncio succeeded, together with the ministers of the Argentine Republic and Uruguay. Next came the ambassador of England, but those of Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Holland awaited instructions from home, little dreaming of the news they were about to receive. The city of Rouen sent 300 of its citizens as a deputation with abundant supplies of arms by the morning cars of the railway. At about noon, the Pont Louis-Philippe was destroyed by fire. Henceforth it is to be Le Pont de la réforme, and so with all other names. Royal is to give place to République, and Liberté, Égalité et Fraternité is to be again inscribed on all public monuments. The children of citizens killed in the Revolution were declared adopted by the country. The civil, judicial, and administrative functionaries of the royal government were announced released from their oaths of office. The colonels of the 12 legions of National Guards were dismissed, and all political prisoners set free. Every citizen was declared an elector, and absolute freedom of thought, the liberty of the press, and the right of political and industrial associations secured to all were proclaimed. A warrant for the arrest of the late ministers was issued by the new Procureur General, M. Portalis, based on an act of accusation presented to the Court of Appeals. But all of them had fled. Guizot is said to have escaped from the Foreign Office in a servant's livery. When the people broke into his hotel, they found only his daughter and retired. The other members of the ministry are said to have leaped from a low window of the Tuileries and to have escaped at the moment of the king's abdication. M. de Cormenin was appointed Conseiller d'État, and M. Achille Maurras, Procureur Général, to the Court of Appeals in Paris in place of the refugees. Such were some of the acts of the 7 men constituting the provisional government of the French Republic during their first extraordinary session of 64 hours. From the hour of 4 o'clock in the afternoon of Thursday, after the dissolution of the Chamber of Deputies, to the hour of 4 o'clock in the morning of Sunday, the 27th of February, when the people of Paris consented to retire to their homes. But during all of this period, night and day, without intermission, every moment, was the Hôtel de Ville surrounded by tumultuous masses, infuriated by suspicion, apprehension, and distrust. For 2 whole days and 2 whole nights, armed men incessantly inundated the square, the courts and halls of the Hôtel de Ville. They insisted on giving to the Republic the character, the attitude, and the emblems of the first revolution. They insisted on a republic violent, sweeping, dictatorial, and terrorist, in language, in gesture, and in color, in place of that determined on moderate, pacific, legal, unanimous, and constitutional. At the peril of their lives, the provisional government resisted this demand. 20 times during those 64 hours was Lamartine taken up, dragged, carried to the doors and windows, or to the head of the grand staircase into the courts and the square, to hurl down with his eloquence those emblems of terrorism with which it was attempted to dishonor the Republic. But the vast and infuriated mass refused to listen, and drowned his voice in clamor and vociferation. At length, when well nigh exhausted in defense of the emblem of a moderate republic, he exclaimed, "The red flag has been nowhere except around the Champ de Mars, trailed in the blood of the people, while the tricolor has been around the world, with our navy, our glory, and our liberties." The furious and hitherto obdurate and bloodthirsty populace became softened. Tears were shed, arms were lowered, flags were thrown away, and peaceably they departed to their homes. Never, never was there a more glorious triumph of eloquence, of patriotism. It was on the morning of Sunday, the 27th day of February, that the provisional government deemed it prudent and proper for them to bring to a close their initiative labors, and once more, for the last time, Lamartine descended the steps of the great staircase of the Hôtel de Ville, and presenting himself in front of the edifice, surrounded by his colleagues, announced to the vast assembly the result of their protracted toil. Royalty abolished, a republic proclaimed, the people restored to their political rights, national workshops opened, the Army and National Guard reorganized, the abolition of death for political offenses. With louder and more prolonged acclamations than any other decree was this last received. and instantly, in accordance with this proclamation, the Director of Criminal Affairs, on the order of M. Crémieux, Minister of Justice, dispatched on the wings of the wind, all over France, the warrant to suspend all capital executions, which were to have taken place, in virtue of royal decrees, until the will of the National Assembly, at once to be convened, should be promulgated on the subject of the penalty of death. The effects of this decree, as it sped on the lightning's wings, like a saving angel all over France, may be imagined, perhaps, but portrayal is impossible. Who can imagine even the joy, the rapture it brought to many a dungeon prisoner who was counting the hours that yet remained to him of life, and preceded his awful doom, or to those who sorrowed over his untimely, perchance his unjust fate? Leaning on the arm of Louis Blanc, the youngest member of the government, the venerable Dupont de Lure, the eldest, accompanied by the other members, now appeared on the balcony of the room formerly called the Chamber of the Throne, but now the Chamber of the Republic. Lamartine then advanced a step before his colleagues, and in a brief and eloquent address proclaimed to that immense throng the existence of the Republic. The announcement was received with acclamations of joy and shouts of "Vive le gouvernement!" "Vive Lamartine!" "Vive Louis Blanc!" mingled with those of "Vive la République!" loudly rose. From the Hôtel de Ville the Provisional Government proceeded in a body, despite the rain which fell in torrents, accompanied by the people, to the Place de la Bastille, there officially to inaugurate the Republic, agreeably to announcement. At the appointed hour the Place de la Bastille was thronged, the National Guard, consisting of 2 battalions from each of the 12 legions of Paris, together with the 13th Legion of Cavalry and 2 battalions of the banlieues, were drawn up from the Church of the Madeleine to the Column of July, and there at the base of that column, erected in commemoration of the revolution which had made Louis Philippe King of the French, his downfall was commemorated, and on the ruins of the throne then established was now inaugurated a republic. During the ceremony of the inauguration, the Marseillaise was sung by the National Guard and the people, and at its conclusion, about the hour of 3, the troops filed off before the Column of July to the thrilling strains of the Marseillaise and the Mourir pour la Patrie of the Girondins. The members of the Provisional Government, preceded by a detachment of the National Guard and accompanied by the pupils of the Polytechnic School and the Military School of Saint-Cyr, then descended the boulevards, followed by the whole of the military and civic array, who chanted the national songs. The effect was stupendous. Hour after hour, the immense procession moved on like a huge serpent through the streets of Paris, and at length, when its head was at the Hôtel de Ville, its extremity had hardly left the Column of July. It was night on Sunday, the 27th of February, when the members of the Provisional Government, for the first time during 4 days, returned to their homes. But their work was accomplished. A republic was gained, proclaimed, and inaugurated. End of section 27. Section 28 of Edmond Dantes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Edmond Dantes by Edmund Flagg. Chapter 26, Dantes and Mercédès. It was a tempestuous night. The wind howled dismally through the streets of Paris, and the rain and sleet dashed fiercely against the casements. At intervals a wild shout might be caught as the blast paused in its furious career, and then a distant shot might be heard. But they passed away, and nothing save the wail of the storm wind or the rushing sleet of the winter tempest was distinguished. But while all was thus wild, dark, and tempestuous without, light, warmth, comfort, and elegance, rendered yet more delightful by the elemental war, reigned triumphant within a large and splendidly furnished apartment in the noble mansion of M. Dantes, the deputy from Marseilles, in the Rue de Elder. Every embellishment which art could invent, luxury court, wealth invoke, or even imagination conceive, seemed there lavished with a most prodigal hand. The soft atmosphere of summer, perfumed by the exotics of a neighboring conservatory, delighted the senses. The mild effulgence of gaslight, transmitted through opaque globes of glass, melted upon the sight, while sofas, divans, and ottomans, in luxurious profusion, invited repose. To describe the rare paintings, the rich gems of statuary, and the other miracles of art which were there to be seen, would be as impossible as it would be to portray the exquisite taste which enhanced the value of each and constituted more than half its charm. Upon one of the elegant sofas reclined Edmond Dantes, his tall and graceful figure draped in a dressing robe, while beside him on a low ottoman sat his beautiful wife, her arm resting on his knee, and her dark, glorious eyes gazing with confiding fondness into his face. Mercédès was no longer the young, light-hearted, and thoughtless being who graced the village of the Catalans. Many years had flown since then, and many sorrows passed over her. Each of these years and each of these sorrows, like retiring waves of the sea upon the smooth and sandy beach, had left behind its trace. No, Mercédès was not now the young, light-hearted, and thoughtless girl she once was, but she was a being far more perfect, far more winning, far more to be loved. She was a matured, impassioned, accomplished, and still, despite the flight of years, most lovely woman. She was one who could feel passion as well as inspire it, and having once felt or inspired it, that passion, it was plain, could never pass lightly away. Her face could not now boast, perhaps, that full and perfect oval which it formerly had, but the lines of care and of reflection, which here and there almost imperceptibly appeared, rendered it all the more charming. In the bold yet beautiful contour of those features, in the full red lips, in the high pale forehead, and above all, in those dark and haunting eyes, lay a depth of feeling and profundity and nobleness of thought, which to a reflective mind have a charm infinitely more irresistible than that which belongs to mere youthful perfection. There was a bland beauty in the smile which slept upon her lips, a delicacy of sentiment in the faint flush that tinged her soft cheek, and a deep meaning in her dark and eloquent eye, which told a whole history of experience even to a stranger, while the full and rounded outline of the figure, garbed in a loose robe of crimson, which contrasted beautifully with her luxuriant dark tresses, had that voluptuous development and grace which only maturity and maternity can impart to the female form. In short, never had Mercédès, in the days of her primal bloom, presented a person so fascinating as now. She was a woman to sigh for, perchance to die for, and one whom a man would willingly wish to live for, if he might but hope she would live for him, or peradventure he might even be willing not only to risk, but ultimately to resign his life, would that fair being not only live for him, but love him with that entire and passionate devotedness which beamed from her dark eyes up into his, who now gazed upon her as she sat at his feet. As for him, as for Edmond Dantes, his figure had now the same elegance, his hand the same delicate whiteness, his features the same spiritual beauty, his brow the same marble pallor, and his eye, which beamed beneath its calm expanse, the same deep brilliancy which years before had distinguished him from all other men and made the Count of Monte Cristo the idol of every salon in Paris and the hero of every maiden's dream. Yet that face was not without its changes. Tears, care, thought, and sorrow had done their work. In the deep lines upon his brow and cheek, in the silvery threads which thickly sprinkled his night-black hair, and, more than all, in the mild light of those eyes, which once glowed only with vindictive hate or gratified revenge, and in the softened expression of those lips which once, in their stern beauty, had but curled with scorn or quivered with rage, could be read that the lapse of time, though it might indeed have made him a sadder man, had made him also a better one. The husband and wife were alone. They still loved as warmly as ever, and if possible more fondly than when first they were made one. Dantes stretched himself out on the sofa, and Mercédès, dropping lower upon the low ottoman at his side, passed her full and beautiful arm around his waist and pressed her lips to his forehead. He returned the embrace with warmth, and placing his own arm about her form, drew it closely to his bosom. Thus they remained clasped in each other's arms, and thus they fixed on each other eyes beaming with love, passion, bliss, happiness unutterable. "My own Edmond," murmured Mercédès, "at length you are again with me, all my own." "Am I not always your own, dearest?" was the fond reply. "But during the week past, I might almost say during the month past, you have been compelled to be so often absent from me." "Ah, love, you know I was not willingly absent," was the quick answer. No, but it was hardly the more endurable for that," said the lady with a smile. "Oh, the anxiety of the last 3 days and nights! Dearest, I do believe I have not slept 3 hours during the whole of those 3 days and nights." "And I, dear, have slept not one," was the laughing rejoinder. "But all is over now, is it not?" "In one sense all is over, and in another all now begins. The monarchy is ended in France, I believe, forever. The republic has begun, and I trust will prove lasting." "And all the grand objects for which you have been striving with your noble colleagues for years and years are at length accomplished, are they not?" "That is a question, love, not easily answered. That the cause of man and France has wonderfully triumphed during the past 3 days is no doubt most true. But this victory, love, I foresaw. Indeed, it was but the inevitable result of an irresistible cause. It was neither chance, love, nor a spontaneous burst of patriotism that on the first day filled the boulevards with 50,000 blouses, which on the second won over to the people 80,000 National Guards, and on the third choked the streets of Paris with barricades constructed by engineers and defended by men completely armed. The events of the last 3 days, Mercédès, have been maturing in the womb of Providence for the past 10 years. It is their birth only which has now taken place, and to some the parturition seems a little premature, I suppose. This banquet caused the fright that hastened the event," added Dantes, laughing. "You are very scientific in your comparisons," replied Mercédès, slightly blushing, "and I suppose I must admit very apt. But tell me, love, is all over? That is, must you be away from me any more at night and wander about, heaven only knows where, in this dark and dangerous city, or heaven only knows with whom or for what?" Dantes kissed his fair wife, and after a pause during which he gazed fondly into her eyes, replied, "I hope, I trust, I believe, dear, that all is over, at least all that will take me from you, as during the past week. France has or will have a republic. That is as certain as fate can make it. But first she will have to pass through strife and tribulation, perhaps bloodshed. The end, surely, love, is not yet, but France is now comparatively free. The dreadful problem is now nearer solution than it ever was. Labor will hereafter be granted to all, together with the adequate reward of labor. Destitution will not be deemed guilt. The death penalty is abolished. The rich will not with impunity grind the poor into powder beneath their heels. Asylums for the suffering, the distressed, the abandoned of both sexes will be sustained. The efforts which as individuals we have some of us made for years to ameliorate the condition of mankind, to assuage human woes and augment human joys, will henceforth be encouraged and directly aided by the state. This revolution, love, is a social revolution, and during the 64 hours the provisional government was in session in the Hôtel de Ville, I became thoroughly convinced that the thousands and tens of thousands who, with sleepless vigilance, watched their proceedings had learned the deep lesson too well to be further deceived, and that the fruits of the revolution they had won would not again be snatched from their lips. And the result of this triumph of the people, you believe, has advanced the cause of human happiness? Asked Mercédès. Most unquestionably, dear, and most incalculably, too, perhaps. All your friends are not as disinterested as you have been, Edmond, said Mercédès. And why think you that, dear? For 6 full years I know you have devoted all your powers of mind and body and all your immense wealth to one single object. And that object has been the happiness of your race. Well, dear, and now, when a triumph has been achieved, now when others who have been but mere instruments, blind instruments, many of them, in your hands to accomplish they knew not what, come forward and assume place and power, you, Edmund, the noble author and first cause of all, remain quietly in seclusion, unknown, unnamed, unappreciated, and uncommended, while the others reap the fruits of your toil? Well, dear, said Dantes, smiling at the warmth of his wife in his behalf, but it is not well, Edmund. I say no one is as disinterested as you. Ah, love, what of ambition? Mercédès smiled. Let me tell you all, love, and then you will not, I fear, think me disinterested, said Dantes seriously. I should blush indeed at praise so little deserved. You know all my early history. I suffered, I was wronged, I was revenged. But was I happy? I sought happiness. All men do so, even the most miserable. Some seek happiness in gratified ambition, some in gratified avarice, some in gratified vanity, and some in the gratification of a dominant lust for pleasure or for power. I sought happiness in gratified revenge. Mercédès shuddered, and, hiding her face on the bosom of her husband, clung to it more closely, as if for protection. Dantes drew her form to his as he would have drawn that of a child, and continued, I sought happiness in vengeance for terrible wrongs, and to win it I devoted a life and countless wealth. What was the result? Misery, misery, misery. Poor Edmund, murmured Mercédès, clinging to him closer than ever. At length I awoke as from a dream. I saw my error. My whole life had been a lie. I saw that God, by a miracle, had bestowed on me untold riches for a nobler purpose than to make his creatures wretched. I saw that if I would be happy, I must make others happy, and to this end, the happiness, not the misery, of my race, must my wealth and power be devoted. To this end, then, did I devote myself, and to this end for 6 years have I been devoted, to make myself happy by making others happy. You, among the rest, dear, dear Mercédès, he added, pressing her to his bosom, and am I then so disinterested? But why should you achieve triumphs for others to enjoy, Edmund? Asked the wife. You refer to the provisional government, said Dantes with a smile. Well, I see I must tell you all, even though by the revelation I prove myself utterly unworthy of the praise of disinterestedness. I may tell you, love, you, my second self, without danger of being charged with egotism, what I might not say to others. Our friend Lamartine is the actual head of this government. I had but to assent to the urgent entreaties to secure that position for myself. These appointments seem the result of nomination by the people, yet they are not. And why did you refuse to head the government, Edmund? I am ashamed to confess to you that I feared to accept, said Dantes after a pause. My own selfishness, not, alas, my disinterestedness, has kept me from the post of peril. Perhaps, indeed, I can do far more for the cause of my race, as I am, than I could by sacrificing myself for office and position. At least I hope so. Is the position of your friends, then, so perilous? Asked Mercédès. Dearest, they stand upon a volcano, said Dantès solemnly. Ha! cried the lady in alarm. Mercédès, Mercédès, continued Dantès with enthusiasm, I sometimes am startled with the idea that to me have been entrusted the awful powers of foreknowledge, of prophecy. So fearfully true have some of my predictions proved. The events of the past week I foresaw and foretold, even to minute circumstances and the hours of their occurrence. And now, glorious as is the triumph that France and the cause of man have achieved, I perceive in the dim future a sea of commotion. All is not yet settled. Within 1 month, revolution will succeed revolution throughout Europe. Berlin, Vienna, and Madrid, perhaps also St. Petersburg, London, and all the cities of Italy will be in revolt. All Europe must and will feel the events of the past week in Paris. Europe must be free. And our friends, Lamartine, Louis Blanc? Within 6 months, Louis Blanc will be in exile, and Lamartine, he may be in a dungeon or on a scaffold. Ah! exclaimed Mercédès, clinging yet more closely to her husband, but the cause of human happiness, human right, and human freedom will live forever. That will be eternal, my adored Mercédès, as is our own deathless love. End of section 28. Section 29 of Edmond Dantes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Edmond Dantes by Edmund Flagg. Chapter 27, Espérance and Zuleika. During the whole period of the memorable revolution, Zuleika never once saw her brother, though she was burning with a desire to have an interview with him on the subject that had caused the separation between her young Italian lover and herself. Espérance made his home behind the barricades from the time the struggle began until the people finally triumphed. Gun in hand, he fought as heroically as the most devoted workman, fearlessly exposing himself whenever the troops pressed his comrades in arms, and always in the thick of the fight. Begrimed with dust and powder, his garments torn by bullets and bayonet thrusts, his hat battered and rent, he encouraged the people by word and example, constantly shouting "Vive la République!" and contending for liberty with the bravery of a lion and a persistency that never flagged. He, however, escaped without a single scratch, returning to the paternal mansion utterly worn out, but altogether unhurt, proud of having done his duty as a man and a patriot, and of having sustained the glorious cause for which his father was working heart and soul. As he was slowly and wearily wending his way homeward, he suddenly encountered M. Dantès and his friend Lamartine in the Rue Richelieu. His gun was on his shoulder, and in his tattered attire, with the dust and powder on his face and hands, he had the exact appearance of an insurrectionist and a barricader. He touched his hat in military fashion to M. Dantès and his illustrious companion, and was about passing on when his father recognized him, and, ragged and begrimed as he was, threw his arms enthusiastically about his neck. M. Lamartine watched the Deputy from Marseilles and could not restrain an expression of astonishment at his singular behavior. M. Dantès smiled, and taking Espérance by the hand, said, "Monsieur Lamartine, you will, I know, make every allowance for me when you learn that this young man, who has been fighting behind the barricades with the people, is my son." The head of the provisional government instantly grew as enthusiastic as Mr. Dantes himself. He grasped Espérance's free hand, and shaking it with the utmost cordiality, exclaimed, "Your son, Monsieur Dantes! Let me congratulate you. Why, he is a perfect hero!" "I have but followed my father's teachings and done what he would have done had he been my age and unable to serve the great cause of human freedom in a more effective way." M. Dantès' eyes sparkled with joy, and a faint shade of color appeared upon his pale cheeks. "What is your name, young patriot?" asked M. Lamartine, his excitement and enthusiasm continuing to hold possession of him. "Espérance," was the reply. "Espérance? Hope! The name is both appropriate and auspicious. With such heroic young men as you fighting for our cause, there is indeed hope, and of the brightest and best kind," cried Lamartine. "Nay, nay," said M. Dantès, "do not flatter the boy. He has but done his duty." "Believe me, I do not flatter him," returned Lamartine. "I have simply told him the truth. In time he will rival the devotion and achievements of his noble father." "Enough, enough," said the Deputy, modestly. "We deserve only the credit of executing God's will. We are merely instruments in His omnipotent hand," he added impressively. "And such instruments are exactly what we need in the present crisis. God grant us plenty of them." The next morning Zuleika encountered Espérance on the stairway. She led him into the salon, and when they were seated, said, "My brother, I have a question to ask of you." A shadow crossed the young man's brow, and he quickly asked, "Is it about the Viscount Massetti?" "Yes." "Then I must refuse to answer." "But the matter concerns my happiness, nay, my very life itself. Think of that before you finally refuse to answer my question." Espérance hastily and excitedly arose from his chair and stood in front of his sister. "Zuleika," said he, in an agitated tone, "beware of that man! Beware of Giovanni Massetti!" "Beware of Giovanni, Espérance? And why?" The young man began to pace the salon with short and nervous steps. His hands twitched convulsively, and his face had suddenly assumed the whiteness of chalk. "Zuleika, Zuleika!" he murmured, I cannot tell you why. It would crash you to the very earth and make you blush with shame that you had ever listened to the seductive tones of that doubly false Italian's voice." "But, Espérance," said Zuleika, "papa certainly knows all about Giovanni. If he did not altogether approve of his character and conduct, he would never have consented to admit him as a suitor for my hand." "A suitor for your hand, Zuleika? My God, has he then dared—" "He has done nothing that an upright and honorable man should not do," interrupted Zuleika, warmly. "He did not even call here until he had written to papa and obtained his full permission to do so." "Zuleika," said Espérance, approaching his sister and taking her hand, "no doubt Giovanni Massetti has conducted himself in all respects toward you like a perfect gentleman, but nevertheless he is not fit to be my sister's husband." "But papa—" "Has been deceived, as have many others, in regard to the true character and standing of this so-called Roman nobleman." "And is he not a nobleman?" "Once more I must refuse to answer any question in regard to him. I can only tell you to beware and shun him as you would a venomous serpent." "Espérance, I love him." "Love him? You love him, Zuleika? Oh, this is indeed torture!" The young man dropped his sister's hand and flung himself upon a divan. He was a prey to the most intense excitement. Zuleika, deeply affected to see him thus, and remembering Giovanni's mysterious behavior, together with his strange and ominous words when she had questioned him in regard to his quarrel with Espérance, felt for a moment shaken and uncertain. She also recollected that at the time of the inexplicable difficulty between the two young men she had heard rumors to the effect that a youthful member of the Roman aristocracy had abducted a beautiful peasant girl, in which affair he had been assisted by the notorious brigand Luigi Vampa. The matter, however, had almost immediately been hushed up, and she had learned none of the circumstances. Could it be possible that Giovanni Massetti was the youthful aristocrat alluded to by the gossips and scandal-mongers of the Eternal City, that he was the abductor of the unfortunate peasant girl? She could not entertain such an idea, and yet that abduction, in spite of all her efforts, would associate itself with her Italian lover in her mind. She arose from her chair, and going to the divan, seated herself beside Espérance, determined to make a final attempt to draw his secret from him. Throwing her arms tenderly about his neck, she said in a coaxing tone, "If any sound reason exists why I should not love Giovanni Massetti, and you know it, your plain duty as my brother is to tell me. Will you not tell me, Espérance?" Instead of replying, the young man buried his face in his hands and fairly sobbed in his anguish. Zuleika was filled with pity for him, and as she gazed at him, tears came into her eyes, but still bent on discovering the nature of the obstacle that had so suddenly loomed up between Giovanni and herself, she continued after a pause in the same coaxing voice, "Espérance, I am no longer a child and should not be treated as one. What I ask of you is only reasonable and just. If I stand on the brink of a gulf I cannot see, it is your duty to inform me not only of my danger, but also of its nature. Am I not right?" Heaving a deep sigh, Espérance replied, "Yes, you are right, Zuleika. It is my duty to tell you all, and yet I cannot." "At least tell me why you are compelled to maintain silence on a matter of so much importance." "Did you question the Viscount?" "I did." "And what answer did he return?" "Like you, he refused to answer." "Ah, then he has some sense of shame left." "Shame?" "Yes, shame. And what did you do when he refused to speak?" "I left him." "And you will not see him again?" "Not until he has decided to tell me all." "Then you will never put eyes upon him more. He dare not tell you." "Dare not, and why?" "Because, did you know the depth of his infamy, you would spurn him from you." Suddenly a grave suspicion stole into Zuleika's mind and made her tremble from head to foot. Might it not be that Espérance had been as deeply involved in the mysterious and infamous affair of which he declined to speak as Giovanni Massetti himself? The thought was torment, and totally unable to restrain her keen anxiety to be instantly informed upon this topic, Zuleika gasped out, "Were you not, Espérance, as guilty as your former friend?" The young man leaped to his feet as if a tarantula had bitten him. "No, no!" cried he. "I was innocent of all blame in the matter. Luigi Vampa—" He abruptly checked himself and stood staring at his sister as if in dismay at having unguardedly uttered the brigand's name. But Zuleika said nothing. Giovanni Massetti also had protested his innocence, and the young girl knew not what to believe. Luigi Vampa? So then he had been a party to this mysterious and terrible business, whatever it was. And again she thought of the abduction of the beautiful peasant girl. Could that be the fearful secret? Yes, it must be. Luigi Vampa had assisted in that abduction, if report could be relied on, and the chief criminal had been a youthful member of the Roman aristocracy. Oh, it was all plain now. Zuleika shuddered and felt her heart grow heavy as lead, while a sharp, killing pang ran through it. Had Espérance been misled by Vampa and the Viscount? Had he discovered too late the infamy of the affair and challenged Massetti on that account? This was doubtless the solution of the whole enigma, and yet Zuleika hesitated to accept it as such. No, no, she could not accept it without further and more convincing proof. But how was that proof to be obtained? Neither the Viscount nor her brother would speak. It was evident that their lips were sealed. Possibly an oath to maintain silence had been extorted from them under terrible circumstances, an oath they feared to break even to clear themselves from a foul suspicion. But Vampa? He might perhaps be induced to give the key to the mystery. Vampa, however, was far away in Rome and inaccessible. Zuleika made a wild resolve. She would write to the brigand and throw herself upon his generosity. Then she decided that the plan was impracticable. Her letter would never reach Vampa. It would be seized by the Roman authorities and might cause additional trouble by reviving a smothered scandal. And even should it reach the brigand, would he answer it? The chances were 100 to 1 that he would not. At this instant an inspiration came to the tortured girl like a flash of lightning. Her father had known Vampa in the past, and perhaps still possessed some influence over him. She had heard the story of Albert de Morcerf's adventure in the catacombs of Saint Sebastian, and was aware that the brigand chief had released him from captivity without ransom at her father's simple solicitation. Would not Vampa answer her questions if M. Dantès could be influenced to write him and ask them? She had full faith in her father's power to get a letter to the bandit, notwithstanding all the vigilance of the Roman authorities. Yes, she would go to him, tell all her suspicions without reserve, and beg him to write the letter. It was hardly likely he would refuse. He could not. He must not. Thus resolved, Zuleika looked her brother full in the face and said calmly, "I see I torture you with my questions, Espérance, that for some reason best known to yourself you cannot answer them, and that it is useless to torment you further. But something must be done, and that at once. I am going to my father." Espérance caught her wildly by the arm. "You are mad!" cried he. "It is you who are mad, you and Giovanni. I tell you I am going to my father. If you are innocent, you have nothing to fear from any revelation I may make." With these words she freed herself from her brother's grasp and quitted the salon, leaving Espérance standing in the centre of the apartment as if he were rooted to the spot. End of section 29. Section 30 of Edmond Dantes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Edmond Dantes by Edmund Flagg. Chapter 28, Captain Joliet's Love. In a small, cozy, and elegant suite of apartments in a mansion on the Rue des Capucines resided Mademoiselle Louise d'Armilly and her brother Léon. As has already been stated, the celebrated cantatrice had retired from the boards in consequence of having inherited a fortune of several millions of francs from the estate of her deceased father, who, rumor asserted, had been a very wealthy Parisian banker. Léon had abandoned the stage simultaneously with his sister, who had invited him to share her suddenly acquired riches, for, strange to say, the banker had not bequeathed to him a single sou. The immense inheritance had been a complete surprise to Mademoiselle d'Armilly, and for some time she had hesitated to accept it, as a condition imposed by the will was her immediate withdrawal from her operatic career. And the prima donna was as ambitious as gifted, but finally she had yielded to the persuasive eloquence of the notary and the earnest entreaties of her friends, cancelling all her engagements and with them abandoning her bright professional future. The director of the Académie Royale demanded a large sum to release the artiste from her contract with him, and this was paid by the notary with an alacrity that seemed to suggest he was not acting solely according to the directions of the will, but was influenced by some personage who chose to remain in the background. The notary also paid all other demands made by the various operatic managers, who claimed they would lose by Mademoiselle d'Armilly's failure to appear. These amounts were not deducted from the legacy, a circumstance that gave additional color to the supposition that the will of the deceased banker was not the sole factor in the celebrated cantatrice's good luck. One evening, shortly after Paris had again quieted down, Mademoiselle d'Armilly was seated in the little apartment that served her as a salon, and with her was her brother Léon. The contrast between the pair seemed intensified in private life. Louise had that dark, imperious, majestic beauty usually possessed by brunettes. Her figure was full and finely developed. Her black eyes had the deep, intense fire of passion, and her faultless countenance, glowing with health and loveliness, indicated at once firmness, decision, and caprices without number. Léon, on the contrary, was delicate and feminine in appearance. He had exceedingly small feet and hands, and a single glance at his strikingly handsome face was sufficient to convince any experienced judge of human nature that he possessed a mild and yielding disposition. The young man bore not the remotest family likeness to his sister, and it was difficult to realize that they could be in any way related. Léon quitted his sister, and going to a piano that stood in one corner of the apartment, softly opened it, and commenced lightly running his fingers over the keys. Then he seated himself at the instrument and played an air from Lucrezia Borgia, with brilliancy and effect that only a finished performer could attain. At the first notes, Louise arose and, approaching the piano, stood beside the player, her eyes sparkling with appreciation and delight. So absorbed were the brother and sister that they did not hear a soft knock at the door, and only at the conclusion of the air did they realize that a visitor was in the apartment. Léon sprang from the instrument in confusion, behaving like a startled girl, but Mademoiselle d'Armilly, with perfect self-control, turned to the newcomer and said in a tone of mingled coquetry and merriment, "So, Captain Joliette, your military career has accustomed you to surprising the enemy to such an extent that it has become second nature with you, and you cannot avoid carrying your favorite tactics even into private life." Captain Joliette, for it was indeed he, bowed and answered with a smile, "You must allow me solemnly to protest against classing yourself and your brother with the enemy. You are both of you very dear friends." "Especially Louise," said Léon, with a sly look and a pretty little ringing laugh. "Léon, when will you learn wisdom?" exclaimed Mademoiselle d'Armilly, a blush mantling her visage and adding to its voluptuous beauty. "Never, I suppose," returned her brother, still laughing, "but I am already well acquainted with the value of discretion, and therefore will withdraw." As he uttered those words, Léon kissed the tips of his fingers to Louise and Joliette, and lightly ran from the salon. When he had disappeared, the Captain folded Mademoiselle d'Armilly in his arms and kissed her tenderly upon the forehead. "Oh, Louise," said he, enthusiastically, "I love you more and more every day." The former artiste gently disentangled herself from his embrace, and, smiling archly, led him to a chair. Then she sat down upon another at a short distance from him. "No, no," said Joliette warmly. "Come and sit beside me on the sofa. Even Léon sees that I adore you, and all my friends in Paris are aware that I am seeking your hand in marriage. Why will you be so formal and distant with me?" She arose and did as he requested. Joliette, seated at her side, put his arm about her waist. Louise did not resist, but still maintained an air of coquetry that was displeasing to the ardent young soldier. "Albert," she said in a low, musical voice, "do you indeed love me as you say?" "Love you, Louise!" cried Joliette. "I would lay down my life for you." "Are you quite sure you love me for myself, and not because of the resemblance you say I bear to the woman you once so ardently admired? What was her name?" "Ah, Eugénie Danglars," said she, looking at him with a piercing gaze. "Quite sure, Louise, quite sure. Besides, Mademoiselle Danglars has disappeared, has not been seen or heard of for several years, and no doubt is dead." "And yet you do not mourn for her. How strange!" "I never loved her as I love you, Louise. Eugénie Danglars was a capricious and eccentric girl, and had she lived would have been a capricious and eccentric woman. It was well for me she vanished when she did. But, by the way, another singular and inexplicable coincidence is that Louise d'Armilly, the name you bear, was also the name of Mademoiselle Danglars' music teacher. I cannot understand it at all." "There is no necessity for you to understand it. Anyhow, it is a coincidence, as you say, nothing more." "Well, Louise, let us speak no further about either the resemblance or the coincidence. Suffice it that I love you, and you alone, that I love you for yourself." "Your words make me very happy, Albert," replied Mademoiselle d'Armilly, and her full red lips looked so luscious, ripe, and alluring that Joliette could not resist the temptation to bestow a long, burning kiss upon them. "Be my wife, then, dearest Louise," cried the Captain, "and I will prolong your happiness until death shall strike me down." Ah, Albert, men are so fickle. They become infatuated with women and declare, and no doubt think, they could pass their lives at their charmer's feet. But possession dulls the lustre of the brightest jewel, and the devoted lover is speedily replaced by a careless, if not faithless, husband, who, instead of making his wife happy, as he has sworn to do, forsakes her side to bask in the smiles of sirens. "It will never be so with me, my own, my love," protested Joliette, kissing her again and again. "I swear it." "I know the value of a lover's oath, Albert," murmured Louise, with a meaning look. "When I was the brightest operatic star of the day, many of them were breathed in my ear, but they were trifles light as air, forgotten as soon as uttered. Besides, should I consent to become your wife, you would be forced to leave me in France and return to Africa, in obedience to the call of duty. The lovely women of Algeria are prodigal of their beauties and endearments, and under the spell of some subtle Arab enchantress you would either forget poor Louise d'Armilly altogether, or remember her only as a clog upon your pleasures and amorous delights." "Nay, nay, you wrong me. Among all the dusky sirens of Algeria there exists not one who could make me forget you for a single instant. They are brazen, shameless women who love with a recklessness and boldness that can only disgust a Frenchman. But they can dazzle even a Frenchman, render him delirious with passion, and ere he is aware, weave a web around him through which he cannot break. My heart tells me you are as susceptible to feminine wiles as the rest of your countrymen, and that perhaps you have already had half a dozen love affairs in Algeria. Oh, Louise, Louise, it grieves me to the soul that you can thus doubt me. Give me a chance to prove my love, and you shall be more than satisfied that I can be loyal and true." Mademoiselle d'Armilly gazed at him with a singular expression on her dark, beautiful countenance. It thrilled him to the very marrow of his bones, and caused his arm that was about her waist to tremble violently. At that moment the former cantatrice resembled Eugénie Danglars more than ever. Her breath was hot and convulsive as it struck his cheek, and a faint suspicion that all was not right, that she was playing a rôle with him, shot across his mind for the first time. With this suspicion came jealousy, and releasing her waist, he said in a gasping tone, "You have another lover, Louise, a lover you prefer to me. Am I not right?" Mademoiselle d'Armilly laughed a short, nervous laugh, and answered in a voice that seemed to mock him, "I have had hosts of ardent admirers in my time. Do you refer particularly to any individual?" "I know not. I am beside myself with passion for you, and the mere fancy that another man may have the first place in your heart is unbearable to me. But there is one conclusive way in which you can prove my suspicion, my jealousy, groundless. Marry me." "Albert," replied Louise, with a renewal of the singular expression of countenance that had so agitated him, "I shall never marry any one. I cannot. I dare not." The young man was startled as if by an electric shock. He drew back and gazed at her with wide-opened eyes, speechless from astonishment. After a brief pause, Mademoiselle d'Armilly continued in a dry, hard tone, "You do not understand me, and I cannot expect you to, for I can neither tell you my motives nor lay bare my sad history to you. You must be content with my decision. I shall not marry." Captain Joliette, strong man as he was, could not control his emotion. He buried his face in his hands and groaned aloud. The young woman gazed at him, half pityingly, half triumphantly. She felt compassion for her stricken lover, but above all gloried in the overwhelming power of her charms that could so subdue a manly, victorious young soldier and make him her helpless slave. "Is there, then, no shadow of a hope?" at length asked Joliette in a hoarse whisper. "Not the shadow of a hope," replied Mademoiselle d'Armilly firmly. "You can be my friend, my brother, if you will, but never my husband." The young man recoiled in horror at the suggestion that seemed to be conveyed by this permission. "What do you mean by friend?" he asked, a cold shiver passing through him. Louise laughed a short, nervous laugh, and looking him full in the eyes, replied, "You know what I mean. I love you better than any man I ever met, save one." Captain Joliette slowly arose to his feet and stood staring at her, his passion and his scruples waging a bitter battle within him for the mastery. The temptress half reclined on the sofa, a miracle of seductive grace and voluptuous beauty. He moved toward her as if to seize her in his arms, then suddenly checking himself, he asked with a convulsive gasp, "And that man, that one?" "Was separated from me forever through the vile machinations of that mysterious and cold-blooded fiend, the Count of Monte Cristo." "The Count of Monte Cristo!" exclaimed the young man, lost in amazement. "Yes, the Count of Monte Cristo, who afterwards disappeared from Paris and has not since been heard of." "You mistake. The Count of Monte Cristo is in Paris now. He calls himself Edmond Dantes, and is the celebrated deputy from Marseilles over whom everybody has gone wild for some time past." Mademoiselle d'Armilly's eyes flashed with fury. "Then I will have my revenge upon him at last!" she cried. "I will amply repay him for introducing the so-called Prince Cavalcanti into my father's house, and thus breaking off the match between Albert and myself." "Albert?" "Yes, Albert de Morcerf. Now, Eugénie Danglars, I know you, and it is useless for you to attempt the denial of your identity longer." The young woman leaped up from the sofa with terror pictured upon her visage, and seizing Captain Joliette by the arm with a powerful grasp, cried out, "And how, pray, do you know I am Eugénie Danglars?" "You unwittingly betrayed yourself by revealing the names of Monte Cristo and Cavalcanti. Besides, Eugénie, look at me well. I am Albert de Morcerf." With a wild cry, the retired prima donna sank back upon the sofa. "You, Albert de Morcerf!" she exclaimed. "I cannot believe it." "But my mother, the former Countess de Morcerf, who is now the wife of Edmond Dantes, will vouch for my identity." The young woman passed her hand across her forehead as if dazed. "If you are Albert de Morcerf, you must despise me after what has taken place this evening," she said, bitterly. "Despise you? No, I pity and forgive you." "Albert," said she, softly, "come here and sit beside me on this sofa. I have something to say to you." The soldier obeyed. When he was seated, he said: "Eugénie, why did you tell me I could be your friend?" "Simply because I have long suspected your secret and wished to ascertain the real nature of your feelings toward me. You not only resisted a terrible temptation, the most terrible temptation to which a young, ardent and passion-smitten man can be exposed, but by your honor conclusively established the purity and sincerity of your love. Oh, Albert, Albert, are you satisfied with my explanation, and do you still think me worthy of you?" "My own Eugénie, my happiness is far too great for words," murmured the delighted young man, gathering his beautiful companion in a warm embrace and repeatedly kissing her ripe lips and blushing cheeks. It was soon known throughout Paris that Captain Joliette and Albert de Morcerf were identical, and that Mademoiselle d'Armilly was in reality no other than Mademoiselle Eugénie Danglars, daughter of Baron Danglars, the once famous and opulent Parisian banker. The report also was current that Albert and Eugénie were engaged and would shortly be united in the bonds of matrimony. Another bit of gossip was to the effect that the former cantatrice's brother Léon was not a man but a woman. In short, the real Louise d'Armilly, who had loaned her name to Eugénie Danglars and assumed male attire solely for professional purposes. This story was speedily confirmed, for Léon soon vanished, and in his place appeared a most attractive and fascinating lady, who very quietly assumed, or rather resumed, the name of Louise d'Armilly. Still another rumor was that the wealth so strangely inherited by the former prima donna was not a legacy at all, but a gift from the mysterious Count of Monte Cristo, who had thus striven to make amends to the daughter for the misfortunes he had, while pursuing his scheme of wholesale vengeance, so remorselessly heaped upon the head of the father. End of section 30. Section 31 of Edmond Dantes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Edmond Dantes by Edmund Flagg. Chapter 29, Zuleika goes to Monsieur Dantes. Monsieur Dantes was sitting alone in his library, busily engaged in reading a favorite work on the subject of political economy, and from time to time making copious notes. It was after midnight, and the vast mansion on the Rue du Helder was as silent as the tomb. The lamp on the deputy's table burned brightly, but a large metallic shade concentrated the light and reflected it upon the table, so that the other portions of the apartment were shrouded in almost complete darkness. As Monsieur Dantes read, a shadow suddenly fell on the page of his book, and quickly looking up, he saw his daughter Zuleika standing beside him. Tears were in her eyes, and a look of melancholy rested upon her countenance. "Why, child," said her father, in a startled tone, "what is the matter with you? You are weeping, and seem very sad. Has anything happened to young Massetti?" "Not that I am aware of, papa," answered Zuleika in a low voice, "but nevertheless it is of him I wish to speak." Monsieur Dantes pushed his book from him, motioned his daughter to a seat, and prepared to listen. As she did not begin at once, but seemed to hesitate, he said kindly, "I am waiting, little one. Proceed." Thus encouraged, Zuleika summoned up all her strength, and with downcast eyes commenced. "Papa," said she, "in the first place, let me assure you that this is no mere lovers' quarrel, but a matter of the utmost importance that demands immediate action." Monsieur Dantes knitted his brows. "Has the Viscount been guilty of any impropriety toward you?" he asked fiercely. "No, papa, not toward me, but I fear he may have been guilty of impropriety, or at least of indiscretion with regard to another in the past." "A woman, no doubt." "Yes, papa, a woman, a Roman peasant." "I heard of some such thing while you were at the convent school in Rome, but dismissed it as a slander." "There may, however, be some truth in it." "But now I recollect, Giovanni's name was not associated with the scandal. It was a mere inference on my part that connected him with the youthful member of the Roman aristocracy mentioned by the gossips." "Perhaps I am unjust, papa, in reviving your suspicions, but Giovanni's strange behavior when I asked him the cause of his quarrel with Espérance and of the continued coldness between them forced me to think there was something wrong." "His quarrel with Espérance? Ah, now I remember, there was a quarrel, but I imagined it was settled, and that their relations were altogether friendly." "They are enemies, papa, or seem to be, and that is not all. Espérance accuses Giovanni of having been guilty of some infamous deed." "You have spoken to Espérance, then, on the subject?" "Yes, papa." "And what did he say?" "He dealt in vague denunciations and positively refused to give me any definite information." "That is singular." "But what is still more so is that both Giovanni and Espérance seem bound by some fearful oath not to disclose the dread secret in their possession." "Bound by an oath?" "Yes, papa, but why both of them should have been so bound, unless they were accomplices, I cannot see. I even went so far as to accuse Espérance of complicity, whereupon he grew as white as chalk and protested his entire innocence, and in his confusion uttered the name of Luigi Vampa." "Zuleika, Zuleika, you certainly misunderstood your brother. He could not have mentioned the name of that man. Do you know who this Luigi Vampa is?" "Perfectly, papa. Luigi Vampa is a notorious Roman brigand." "Exactly, my child, and therefore could not possibly have had any dealings either with the Viscount or Espérance." "But I am sure of the name, nevertheless. Espérance said Luigi Vampa." Monsieur Dantès was evidently startled. He arose to his feet and paced the library excitedly. Zuleika had expected this, and hence was not surprised. At last her father resumed his seat, and when he again came within reach of the lamp's rays, she saw that his visage was even more pallid than usual, and that he was not a little agitated. She waited for him to speak, and in a few seconds he did so. "Zuleika," said he, in a tone of decision, "I will see both the Viscount and my son in regard to this matter, for now that Luigi Vampa seems to have had a share in it, close investigation is imperatively demanded." "You may interrogate them, papa, but I am convinced in advance that you will derive no information from either of them. The strange power that holds sway over them you cannot break. But there is one thing you can do." "What is that, Zuleika?" "Write to Luigi Vampa." "Write to Vampa? Why should I do that?" "Because I feel assured that he is in possession of the full details of the terrible secret, whatever it may be, and will communicate them to you if you ask him to do so." M. Dantès gazed at his daughter curiously. "What makes you think I have such influence over this Roman brigand?" he asked sharply. "Oh, papa, do not be angry with me!" cried Zuleika, "but I have heard how Vampa released the Viscount de Morcerf at your simple solicitation without a single franc of ransom, though he had previously demanded a very large amount from the unfortunate man as the price of his liberty. I have heard this, and the natural inference I drew was that, if the brigand chief went so far as to surrender his prey to you, he would certainly answer your letter and tell you all he knew about the matter that so closely concerns my happiness and Espérance's good name." "I am not angry with you, my child," replied the Deputy in a milder tone, "for I know how deeply you have this affair at heart. I will write to Luigi Vampa, as you desire, this very night, and in 2 weeks at the furthest his answer may be expected. But to-morrow I will talk with Espérance, and then will question the Viscount. Rest assured that this matter shall be sifted to the bottom. I know the extent of your love for Giovanni Massetti. I also feel confident that I am not deceived in him, and that he will be amply able to prove himself entirely worthy of your hand. I have seen too much of men, Zuleika, and studied them too deeply to be deceived in reading character." "Oh, thank you ever so much, papa, both for your promise and your kind, encouraging words. I, too, have full faith in Giovanni, but still I cannot rest satisfied until his record is entirely and conclusively cleared. No one must have the power to breathe even a suspicion against the good name of your daughter's husband." "Spoken like a girl of spirit," said M. Dantès, his eyes sparkling with enthusiasm and admiration. "Now leave me, and I will write to Vampa." Zuleika kissed her father and quitted the library with a much lighter heart than she had entered it. M. Dantès, by the exercise of his iron will, had managed to control himself in her presence, but now that she had gone he gave free course to his emotions. For a full hour he sat leaning on his writing table, his frame convulsed with anguish and his mind filled with sad forebodings. He did not for an instant doubt that both Espérance and the Viscount could clear themselves from any criminal or dishonorable charge if they would consent to open their lips, but their silence and Zuleika's belief that they were bound by some fearful oath gave him great uneasiness. Besides, his son had mentioned Luigi Vampa's name, and the thought that the young man was involved in some complication with the Roman bandit sent a chill to his heart. He was convinced that whatever had occurred had been merely the result of the folly and headlong disposition of youth, but this was scarcely a consolation, for he well knew to what length young men sometimes allowed themselves to be carried, especially in what they considered a love affair. In addition, the more he thought of the half-forgotten Roman scandal, the more clearly its particulars returned to him. He remembered that a young and handsome peasant girl had been mysteriously abducted, and that eventually she had been brought back to her home by one of the shepherds known to be in league with Luigi Vampa and his band. She asserted that she had been carried off to the bandits' haunt by her youthful lover, who had passed for a peasant lad, but was in reality a nobleman. This was all M. Dantès could distinctly recall, though he was certain he had heard other details that had slipped his memory. At the period of the abduction, he now remembered, both Espérance and the Viscount were temporarily absent from Rome. Then followed their return, and the quarrel that had almost resulted in a duel, but had suddenly been patched up without apparent reason. Had Espérance and the Viscount been concerned in the abduction? That was a question that only they or Luigi Vampa could answer, and it was evident the young men would not speak. Vampa then must be made to speak for them. That was the sole course left to pursue, for the peasant girl had disappeared immediately after her return, and her whereabouts were a mystery. M. Dantès drew writing materials before him and wrote his letter to the brigand chief. It was brief, but to the point. When it was finished, it bore the signature Edmond Dantes, Count of Monte Cristo. The deputy placed it in the drawer of his table to go by mail the following morning, having first folded and sealed it. Thomson and French, Rome, was the direction it bore. End of section 31. Section 32 of Edmond Dantes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Edmond Dantes by Edmund Flagg. Chapter 30. 2 Interviews. The morning following the events detailed in the last chapter, as Espérance was in his dressing-room preparing to take a short stroll through Paris, Ali knocked at the door and signified that M. Dantès wished to see him at once in the library. As such a summons was something unusual, the young man immediately concluded that Zuleika had been in consultation with her father, and that he would now have to submit to a close and rigid examination. He had expected such an examination, but nevertheless the summons filled him with dismay, and he grew pale as wax, his limbs trembling beneath him and his hands working nervously. However, he braced up as well as he could, and with as firm a step as it was possible for him to assume, walked toward the library. On the threshold he paused, and his courage so utterly forsook him that he was tempted to take refuge in flight. But the thought flashed through his mind that this would be cowardly, and making a supreme effort to control himself, he entered his father's presence. M. Dantès, who was seated at his writing-table examining a curious manuscript written in Arabic characters, looked up as he came in and fixed his eyes searchingly upon his son's countenance, noting its extreme pallor and remarking with manifest uneasiness the difficulty Espérance experienced in maintaining a firm demeanor. Motioning the young man to a seat, he said, "My son, I have sent for you on a matter of the utmost importance, and I sincerely hope you will see fit to tell me in all frankness whatever you may know in regard to it." Espérance partially closed his eyes, as if suffering intensely, bringing his teeth firmly together and compressing his lips. As he did not speak, M. Dantès continued, "I have every reason to believe that the revelation I am about to ask of you will be exceedingly painful for you to make, but you must consider that your sister's happiness is deeply concerned, and that for that reason, no matter what may be your motives, you have not the right to maintain silence." "I know what you mean, father," replied Espérance in an unsteady voice, "but notwithstanding the pain it gives me to do so, I must ask you, nay, entreat you not to question me, for I cannot answer you." M. Dantès cast upon his son a glance that seemed to pierce him through and through. The young man quailed beneath it and again partially closed his eyes, while a faint blue shade was mixed with the waxen pallor of his visage. The Deputy, though he had made a profound and exhaustive study of men and their varied motives, though he was a skilled anatomist of the human heart and a ready reader of the human countenance, acknowledged to himself that this time he was completely baffled. Was it fear or guilt that Espérance exhibited? He could not tell, but it was abundantly evident that the young man was not acting a part, that he keenly felt the suspicions to which he was exposing himself by his inexplicable conduct. At length M. Dantès said in a mild but determined tone, "Espérance, my son, you can at least enlighten me upon a few points, and I request, nay, I command you to do so. Are you bound by oath to preserve silence concerning this matter?" "I am bound by a most solemn oath," answered the young man with a shudder. "And is Giovanni Massetti likewise so bound?" "He is." "I will not ask you who administered that oath to you or under what circumstances it was taken, although as your father I have a right to do so and to compel you to answer. Neither will I interrogate you further in regard to the main question at issue, the complication in which you and the Viscount seem to be so hopelessly involved, but I insist that you inform me whether any guilt or stain of dishonor rests upon you." "Father," said Espérance, rising and lifting his right hand toward heaven, "I solemnly swear to you that whatever wrong may have been done, whatever crime may have been committed, I am entirely guiltless, and that there is not the slightest stain of dishonor upon me." "I believe you, my son," said M. Dantès in a tone of conviction, "and this unequivocal assurance from your own lips removes the weight of a mountain from me. Now tell me, is the Viscount Massetti as blameless in this affair as you are?" "The so-called Viscount Massetti is a black-hearted villain," cried Espérance excitedly. "He is guilty of a foul and revolting crime, a crime that should condemn him to a life of penal servitude." "But may you not be mistaken? May you not be the victim of some delusion?" asked M. Dantès anxiously. "I am neither mistaken, father, nor the victim of a delusion," replied Espérance positively. "The charges that I make against that miserable apology for a man I can fully substantiate should the proper opportunity ever be offered me." "Zuleika informed me that while you were speaking with her upon this mysterious subject, the name of Luigi Vampa escaped your lips. Does that notorious brigand possess a knowledge of this unfortunate matter?" Espérance became violently agitated and instantly answered, "That is a question my oath forbids me to reply to." "So be it," said M. Dantès, "but I have written him, and he will reply for you." "You have written to Vampa?" exclaimed the young man with a terror-stricken look. "Then all is lost!" M. Dantès smiled and, rising, placed his hand on his son's shoulder. "Espérance," said he, calmly, "if neither crime nor dishonor attaches to you in this affair, as you have sworn, you have nothing whatever to fear. And besides, Vampa's disclosures may relieve you of some portion of your heavy burden." "Oh, God!" groaned the young man. "If Vampa speaks, how shall I be able to prove my innocence?" "My son," said M. Dantès impressively, "God, whose name you have invoked, will not desert you in your hour of need." Bowing his head in his hands and trembling like an aspen leaf, Espérance quitted the library with a convulsive sob, as if the last ray of hope had been withdrawn from his life and all was darkness and despair. M. Dantès threw himself in his chair and for an instant was plunged in absorbing thought. Then he arose and, putting on his hat and cloak, left the library. A few moments later he had quitted the mansion by a private door. Closely muffling his face in the folds of his cloak that he might not be recognized, the Deputy from Marseilles passed hurriedly from street to street until he stood before a massive building in the Rue Vivienne. He rang the bell, and when the concierge appeared, said to her, "Is the Viscount Massetti at home?" The woman, a large, fat, lumbering creature, cast a sleepy glance that was half curious, half suspicious at him, and answered, "Yes, monsieur, but he bade me deny him to everybody." "He will see me, however, my good woman," said M. Dantès. "Take my card to him." The fat concierge took the card and glanced at it. When she read Edmond Dantes, deputy from Marseilles, she stared at the famous Republican leader like one possessed. Then, filled with awe, she hastened away and climbed the stairs as fast as her cumbersome legs would let her. She returned, panting and puffing, followed by the Viscount's valet, who, with much ceremony and obsequiousness, conducted the distinguished visitor to his master's apartments. The salon into which M. Dantès was ushered was large and sumptuously furnished. Evidences of wealth and luxury were visible on every side, while everything displayed the utmost taste and elegance. "To what am I indebted for the honor of this unexpected visit, my dear Count?" said Massetti, rising from a handsomely carved red velvet upholstered arm-chair in which he had been indolently reclining, and coming forward to greet his guest. "To a matter that concerns both of us deeply," replied the Deputy, in a meaning tone. A shadow crossed the Viscount's handsome visage, but it was gone in an instant, and he said, with the utmost politeness: "Pray be seated, my dear Count, and before proceeding to business refresh yourself with a glass of rare old Burgundy. Here, Stephano, wine and glasses." M. Dantès sat down in an arm-chair precisely resembling that from which the Viscount had arisen. Massetti resumed his seat, and the valet brought the old Burgundy and glasses, placing the decanter and drinking vessels on a small table of glistening ebony between his master and the Deputy. After they had duly drunk each other's health, M. Dantès said: "I regret, my dear Viscount, that I am compelled to disturb you, but my business was too urgent for delay." "You don't disturb me in the least. Pray proceed." "You remember your conversation with my daughter just before you and she parted, do you not?" "I remember it," replied the Viscount, coloring slightly and evidently growing ill at ease. "In that case, neither preface nor explanation is necessary. I called to ask you a few plain questions." The Italian was now a prey to singular excitement. He grew pale and flushed by turns, finally rising and pacing the salon in great agitation. "Count," said he, abruptly, when he could command his voice, "you are a man of the world and a cosmopolitan, and of course you know that one often commits folly, especially when the ardent and uncontrollable blood of youth is rushing through his veins. With this explanation, imperfect though it be, I must ask you to rest satisfied, for it is utterly out of my power to give you any other or to enter into the details of the unfortunate affair which has brought you here. I assure you, however, that I am altogether blameless in the matter. Investigation will abundantly establish the truth of what I say." "I will make that investigation." "I regret that I can neither empower you to do so nor aid you in it." "What am I to understand by that?" "Simply what I say." "You are doubtless aware that my son makes grave accusations against you, that he accuses you, in fact, of a dastardly crime." "Espérance is mistaken, my dear Count. I swear to you that he is mistaken and that I am as innocent as he is. But Luigi Vampa may have a different tale to tell." "Luigi Vampa?" cried the Viscount, coming instantly to a dead halt and a sudden pallor overspreading his entire visage. "Yes, Luigi Vampa. I have written to him, and in 2 weeks will have his answer." "For Espérance's sake, for my sake, for your daughter's sake, destroy that answer as soon as received and without reading it," exclaimed the young Italian wildly, his pallor increasing to such a degree that his face resembled that of a corpse. "Should I be mad enough to do so," said M. Dantès, calmly, "with it all hope of your marriage with Zuleika would perish." "Oh, do not say that, do not say that!" groaned Massetti. "What would life be worth to me without Zuleika's love?" "Then deserve that love by clearing yourself, by proving that your record will bear the light of day." "I have sworn to you that I am innocent. Is not that enough?" "No!" replied M. Dantès coldly. "I must have proof to support your oath." "Then you believe me guilty in spite of all? This is the worst blow yet." "It is in your power to completely justify yourself. At least so you give me to understand, and yet your refusal will forever separate you from the woman you love." "You fill me with despair," said Massetti, in a smothered voice, sinking upon a sofa. "I fain would reveal everything to you, but an awful oath of silence stands between me and the revelation." "Then I must wait for Vampa's answer and shape my course by that," said M. Dantès firmly. "That answer will destroy both Espérance and myself," replied the Viscount in a hoarse whisper. "We shall see," returned the Deputy, rising and resuming his cloak. As he stood at the door of the salon with his hat in his hand, he added: "I thought you all a man should be, Viscount, and that you would make Zuleika happy, but my convictions have been sadly shaken. I came here thinking that love for woman was all powerful in the heart of man, that it would induce you to speak, even in the face of an oath, perhaps violently and iniquitously administered. I was wrong. Farewell." M. Dantès turned slowly and took his departure, leaving Giovanni Massetti on the sofa, plunged in grief and dismay. Section 33 of Edmond Dantes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Edmond Dantes by Edmund Flagg. Chapter 31. Vampa's Answer. As the time for the arrival of Luigi Vampa's answer to M. Dantès' letter approached, Espérance grew more and more uneasy and serious. He spent the greater portion of every day from home, apparently for the purpose of avoiding his father and sister. When he returned, he was moody, depressed, and silent, and far into the night he could be heard pacing his chamber, as if unable to sleep from excitement and anxiety. Zuleika endeavored to comfort him, but all her efforts were fruitless. She, poor girl, was herself overwhelmed with her own distress, though she strove to bear up against it. Massetti had neither written to nor attempted to see her since their separation, a circumstance she could not reconcile with his protestations of ardent love for her, and this served vastly to augment her sadness and anguish, though she still believed in her soul that the Viscount was entirely innocent of the crime laid to his charge. M. Dantès, who had plunged into politics deeper than ever since the success of the Revolution, was frequently in consultation with the Republican leaders, and many of them visited him at his residence and were closeted with him for hours at a time. But though seemingly engrossed in state affairs, the Deputy did not lose sight of his son and daughter, or of the mysterious complication that Vampa was expected to make clear. Ali had strict orders to watch both Zuleika and Espérance, and to report to his master whatever they did when at home in his absence, but the faithful Nubian found nothing amiss, save that the young people seemed burdened with a sorrow he could not fathom. At length, when the 2 weeks that it would take to hear from Rome had expired, M. Lamartine called one morning at the mansion in the Rue du Helder, and having finished his business with M. Dantès, was invited by his host to remain to lunch. The repast was served in the salle à manger, Espérance and Zuleika partaking of it with their father and his illustrious guest. When the edibles had been removed and the party were taking wine at the dining table, M. Dantès, suddenly remembering that he had an engagement, begged M. Lamartine to excuse him and remain with his son and daughter until his return, that would be in half an hour at the utmost. This arrangement effected, the Deputy arose from his chair, threw his cloak over his arm, and was about to take his departure, when Ali appeared on the threshold of the open doorway, bearing in his hand a letter. Instantly divining that this was Vampa's answer, upon which hung Massetti's fate and his own, Espérance leaped to his feet and fixed his wild and staring eyes on the ominous missive, as if he would read its contents through its folds. Zuleika retained her seat, but lifted her hands in terror, and stared at the letter with pallid cheeks and blanched lips. Even Lamartine turned in his chair, and, holding his glass in his hand, gazed wonderingly at the Nubian and the epistle. M. Dantès alone seemed unmoved, and his pale countenance gave no sign of the emotion struggling in his breast. He stood like a man of iron, and, extending his hand, took the letter without a tremor. It was enclosed in a curiously fashioned envelope, evidently made by the writer himself, and bore the Roman postmark. The direction, written in bold, scrawling, but perfectly legible characters, read: Monsieur Edmond Dantes, Deputy from Marseilles, No. 27 Rue du Helder, Paris, France, personal and private. This direction was in French. Ali having retired, the Deputy calmly broke the seal and hurriedly ran his eyes over the missive. Espérance and Zuleika eagerly and breathlessly watched his countenance while he read, but it was as impassible as a countenance chiseled from marble. When he had finished, he turned to Espérance, and without a word handed him the letter. For a moment the young man trembled so he could not read. Cold perspiration stood in heavy beads upon his forehead, and vivid flashes of red passed before his eyes like sheets of lurid lightning. What thoughts, what suspicions, what dread shot through his tortured mind in that brief moment, making it seem an eternity of suffering! At last, steadying and controlling himself by a supreme effort, he read the missive from which he had feared such terrible consequences. It was in Italian, and ran as follows: His Excellency the Count of Monte Cristo, you ask me to answer your questions, and I comply. Pasquale Solara's daughter, Annunziata, was abducted from her father's peasant home by Giovanni Massetti, known as the Viscount Massetti, who is, no doubt, the person to whom you allude as now in Paris, for he has disappeared from Rome. You are right in assuming that he had aid. He was assisted by a young Frenchman, and that young Frenchman was your son, Espérance. Annunziata suffered the usual fate of abducted peasant girls, and was deserted by her dastardly abductor in a fastness controlled by my band. When the abduction took place, Annunziata's brother strove to rescue her, but was attacked and killed by Massetti. Through my means the girl was returned to her home, but she was miserable there and fled. She is now in an asylum for unfortunate women, founded at Civita Vecchia by the Order of Sisters of Refuge, and superintended by a French lady, a Madame Helena de Rancogne, who, as is said, was formerly called the Countess of Monte Cristo. It is due to your son to say that he was entirely misled in regard to the abduction of Annunziata Solara, and is altogether innocent of crime or intention to commit it. The whole burden of guilt rests upon the shoulders of the Viscount Massetti, who, I believe, compelled your son at the pistol's mouth to take a fearful oath of silence. Luigi Vampa. When Espérance had read this letter that so effectually cleared him, and was such a fearful arraignment of the Viscount Massetti, he restored it to his father and sank into his chair, utterly overcome by the terrible excitement and mental strain through which he had passed. M. Dantès forced him to swallow a glass of wine that partially restored him. Then, turning to M. Lamartine, who had been an astonished spectator of this strange and to him incomprehensible family scene, he said: "My dear friend, you are amazed, and you have a right to be. This letter, that has caused my son and daughter so much emotion, comes from a Roman brigand chief, no other than Luigi Vampa, whose name is notorious throughout Europe. You will understand its importance when I inform you that it conclusively clears my son of an exceedingly grave charge." Monsieur Lamartine arose and took Espérance by the hand. "I heartily congratulate you," said he. "And Giovanni Massetti?" asked Zuleika in a tremulous voice. "Giovanni Massetti is unworthy of my daughter's hand," replied M. Dantès. "Let me see that letter," said Zuleika, her cheek growing paler and her heart beating tumultuously. Her father gave it to her. She took it and read each line with an intensity of interest that was painful to behold. When she had reached the end, her eyes suddenly lighted up, and the color came rushing back to her pallid cheeks. "Espérance," she said, facing her brother with an air of resolution beneath which he quailed, "Luigi Vampa has not told all. Something he has kept back, and that something you know. What is it? Speak!" "Luigi Vampa has told the truth," replied the young man, doggedly. "Yes, but not the whole truth. What has he kept back?" Espérance shook his head. "He has told the truth," he repeated. "Did the Viscount Massetti administer the oath of silence to you?" "He did." "Then who administered that oath to Giovanni?" The young man did not answer. "There is some mystery about this complicated affair, yet unexplained, and until it is explained I cannot believe Giovanni Massetti guilty." "Come, come, my daughter," said M. Dantès, soothingly, "your heart speaks and not your mind." "My heart and mind both speak, papa," replied Zuleika, "and both say that Giovanni Massetti is innocent." "Let him prove it, then." "I feel certain that he can and will." "Well, well, child, go to Madame Dantès and take counsel of her. Only a woman can heal a young girl's love wounds." Zuleika quitted the salle à manger, her countenance yet bearing the stamp of an inflexible belief and a fixed determination. "Espérance," said M. Dantès, "your honor is unstained and you are restored to my heart. I thank God for the blessings of this day." "You are a true father, Edmond, as well as a true patriot," said M. Lamartine, "and I feel assured that your son will be worthy of you and of our beloved France." That very day Giovanni Massetti received an unsigned little note written in a tiny feminine hand. It was phrased thus: "I believe you innocent in spite of all. Prove to me and to the world that you are so." Enclosed in this little note was Luigi Vampa's letter to M. Dantès. The next morning it became known that the Viscount Massetti had disappeared from Paris. Gossip assigned 1,000 scandalous motives for his sudden flight, but gossip could form no idea as to whither he had fled. Zuleika, however, knew that he had returned to Italy to clear his name and prove himself worthy of her love. End of Section 33. End of Edmond Dantes by Edmund Flagg.